What has passed shall in kinder light appear. By Baoshu. My parents named me Baoshu, hoping I would live a life full of precious memories. I was born on the day the world was supposed to end. Mom and Dad told me how strange flashing lights appeared in the sky all over the globe, accompanied by thunder and lightning, as though the heavens had turned into a terrifying battlefield. Scientists could not agree on the explanation. Some said extraterrestrials had arrived. Some suggested the Earth was passing through the galactic plane. Still, others claimed that the universe was starting to collapse. The apocalyptic atmosphere drove many into church pews, while the rest shivered in their beds. In the end, nothing happened. As soon as the clock struck midnight, the world returned to normality. The crowds, teary-eyed, embraced each other and kissed, thankful for God's gift. Many petitioned for that day to be declared the world's new birthday as a reminder for humanity to live more honestly and purely and to treasure our existence. The grateful mood didn't last long, and people pretty much went on living as before. The Arab Spring happened, followed by the global financial crisis. Life had to go on, and we needed to resolve troubles both big and small. Everyone was so busy that the awkward joke about the end of the world never came up again. Of course, I had no memory of any of this. I was born on that day. I had no impressions of the next few years either. My earliest memory was of the opening ceremony of the Olympics. I was only 4 then, but nonetheless caught up in the excitement all around me. Mom and Dad told me, "China's going to host the Olympics." I had no idea what the Olympics were, just that it was an occasion worth celebrating. That night, Mom took me out. The streets were packed, and she held me up so that I could see overhead immense footprints formed by fireworks. One after another, they appeared in the night sky, as if some giants were walking above us. I was amazed. The neighborhood park had a large projection screen, and Mom brought me there to see the live broadcast. I remember there were many, many people, and it was like a big party. I looked around and saw Kiki. She was wearing a pink skirt and a pair of shoes that lit up. 2 braids stuck out from the top of her head like the horns of a goat. Smiling sweetly, she called out, "Bao Gugu!" Kiki's mother and Mom were good friends from way back, before they both got married. I was only a month older than Kiki, and had almost certainly seen her lots of times before that night, but I couldn't remember any of those occasions. The opening ceremony of the Olympics was the first memory I could really recall with Kiki in it. It was the first time I understood what pretty meant. After we ran into Kiki and her parents, our 2 families watched the live broadcast together. While the adults conversed, Kiki and I sat next to a bed of flowers and had our own chat. Later, an oval-shaped, shiny gigantic blankets appeared on the screen. "What's that?" I asked. "It's called the bird's nest," Kiki said. There were no birds inside the nest, but there was an enormous scroll with flickering animated images that were very pretty. Kiki and I were entranced. "How do they make those pictures?" Kiki asked. "It's all done with computers," I said. "My dad knows how to do it. Someday I'll make a big picture, too, just for you." Kiki looked at me, her eyes full of admiration. Later, a little girl about our age sang on the screen, and I thought Kiki was prettier than her. That was one of the loveliest, most magical nights of my life. Later, I kept hoping China would host the Olympics again, but it never happened. After I became a father, I told my son about that night, and he refused to believe China had once been so prosperous. I had no clear memories of kindergarten either. Kiki and I went to the same English immersion kindergarten, in which half the class were conducted in English, but I couldn't recall any of it. I certainly didn't learn any English. I did remember watching Peasant's Goat and Big Big Wolf with Kiki. I told her that I thought she was like Beauty, the cute lamb in the cartoon. She said I was like Grey Wolf. If I'm Grey Wolf, I said, you must be Red Wolf. Red Wolf was Grey Wolf's wife. She pinched me, and we fought. Kiki was always ready to hit me to get her way, but she also cried easily. I only pushed back a little bit, and she started sobbing. I was terrified she might tattle on me and rushed to the fridge to get some red bean flavored shaved ice for her, and she broke into a smile. We went on watching Chibi Maruko-chan and The Adventures of Red Cat and Blue Rabbit while sharing a bowl of shaved ice. We played and fought and played, and before we knew it, our childhood had escaped us. Back then, I thought Kiki and I were so close that we'd never be apart. However, before we started elementary school, Kiki's father got a promotion at work, and the whole family had to move to Shanghai. Mom told me to say goodbye. While the adults became all misty-eyed, Kiki and I ran around, laughing like it was just some regular playdate. Then Kiki got on the train and waved at me through the window like her parents were doing, and I waved back. The train left and took Kiki away. The next day, I asked Mom, "When's Kiki coming back? How about we all go to Tiananmen Square next Sunday?" But Kiki wasn't back the next Sunday, or the one after that. She disappeared from my life. I didn't get to see her again for many years, until my memory of her had blurred and sunk into the depths of my heart. In elementary school, I made a good friend. Everyone called him Haizi because he was dark and skinny. Haizi and I lived in the same neighborhood, and his family was in business. Supposedly, his dad made his fortune by flipping real estate. Haizi wasn't a good student and often asked to copy my homework. To show his gratitude, he invited me over to his house to play. His family owned a very cool computer hooked up to an ultra-high-def LCD screen that took up half a wall. Fantastic for racing or fighting games, though the adults didn't let us play for long. But when we were in the 3rd grade, SARS was going around and some kid in the neighborhood got sick, so we all had to be taken out of school and quarantined at home. We ended up playing games the whole day, every day. Good times. During those months in the shadow of SARS, the adults had gloomy expressions and sighed all the time. Everyone hoarded food and other consumables at home and seldom went out. When they did, they wore face masks. They also forced me to drink some kind of bitter Chinese medicine soup that supposedly provided immunity against SARS. I was old enough to understand that something terrible was going on in China and the rest of the world, and felt scared. That was my first experience of the dread and panic of a world nearing doom. One time, I overheard Mom and Dad discussing some rumor that tens of thousands of people had died from SARS, and I ended up suffering a nightmare. I dreamed that everyone around me had died so that I was the only one left, and the United States was taking advantage of the SARS crisis to attack China, dropping bombs everywhere. I woke up in a cold sweat. Of course, nothing bad really happened. The SARS crisis ended up not being a big deal at all. But it was a start. In the days still to come, my generation would experience events far more terrifying than SARS. We knew nothing of the future that awaited us. During the SARS crisis, I dreamed of an American attack on China because the US had just conquered Iraq and Afghanistan and managed to catch Saddam. They were also looking for a man named Bin Laden, and it was all over the news. I watched the news during dinner time, and I remember being annoyed at America. Why are the Americans always invading other countries? I felt especially bad for Saddam, a pitiable old man captured by the Americans and put on trial. And they said he was going to be executed. How terrible. I kept hoping the Americans would lose. Amazingly, my wish came true. Not long after SARS, the news reports said that something called the Iraqi Republic Guard had mobilized and rescued Saddam. Saddam led the resistance against the American invasion and somehow managed to chase the U.S. out of Iraq. In Afghanistan, a group called Tally something also started an uprising and waged guerrilla war against the American troops in the mountains. Bin Laden even succeeded in planning a shocking attack that brought down 2 American skyscrapers using airliners. The Americans got scared and retreated in defeat. 2 years later, I started middle school. Heizi and I were in the same school but different classes. My first year coincided with another apocalypse predicted by an ancient calendar. I had no idea back then why there were so many apocalyptic legends. Maybe everyone felt living in this world wasn't safe. Those were also the years when the world economy was in a depression and lots of places had difficulties. Russia, a new country called Yugoslavia, Somalia. The desperate Americans even decided to bomb our embassy in Belgrade. People were so angry that college students marched to the American embassy and threw rocks at the windows. However, the life of the middle school students was very different. The costume drama Princess Pearl was really popular, and they showed it all the time on TV. Everyone in my class became addicted, and all we could talk about was the fate of Princess Xiaojianzi. We didn't understand politics and paid very little attention to those world events. Gradually, though, the effects of the worldwide depression became apparent in daily life. Real estate prices kept crashing. Heizi's father lost money in his property deals and turned to day trading stocks, but he was still losing money. Although prices for everything were falling, wages dropped even faster. Since no one was buying the high-tech gadgets, they stopped making them. The huge LCD screen in Heizi's home broke, but they couldn't find anything similar in the market and had to do with the clumsy CRT monitor. The screen was tiny and convex, which just looked weird. My father's notebook computer was gone, replaced by a big tower that had much worse specs. Supposedly, this was all due to the depressed American economy. Over time, websites failed one after another, and the new computer games were so bad that it was no longer fun to mess around on the computer. Street arcades became popular, and kids our age went to hang out at those places, while the adults began to practice traditional Chinese meditation. There was one benefit to all this progress. The sky over Beijing became clear and blue. I remember that, when I was little, every day was filled with smog and it was difficult to breathe. Now, however, other than during sandstorm season, you could see blue sky and white clouds all the time. In the summer of my second year in middle school, Kiki returned to Beijing for a visit and stayed with my family. She was tall and slender, almost 5'3", and wore a pair of glasses. With her graceful manners and big eyes, she was closer to a young woman than a girl, and I still thought she was pretty. When she saw me, she smiled shyly. Instead of calling me Bao Ge like a kid, she addressed me by my given name, Baoshu. She had lost all traces of her Beijing accent and spoke in the gentle tones of southern China, which I found pleasing. I tried to reminisce with her about the Olympics and watching Pleasant Goat and Big Wolf. Disappointingly, she told me she couldn't remember much. I overheard Mom and Dad saying that Kiki's parents were in the middle of a bitter divorce and were fighting over every bit of property in Kiki's custody. They had sent Kiki away to Beijing to avoid hurting her while they tore into each other. I could tell Kiki was unhappy because I heard her cry in her room the night she arrived. I didn't know how to help her except to take her around to eat good food and see interesting sights, and to distract her with silly stories. Although Kiki had been born in Beijing, she was so young when she left that she might as well have been a first-time visitor. That whole summer she rode behind me on my bicycle, and we toured every major avenue and narrow hutong in the city. We grew close again, but it wasn't the same as our childhood friendship. Rather, our budding adolescence colored everything. It wasn't love, of course, but it was more than just friendship. Kiki got to know my good friends, too. Heizi, in particular, came over to my home much more frequently now that a young woman was living there. One time, Heizi and I took Kiki to hike the Fragrance Hills. Heizi paid a lot of attention to Kiki, helping her up and down the rocky steps and telling her jokes. While Kiki and Heizi chatted happily, I felt annoyed. That was when I first noticed I didn't like others intruding between Kiki and me, not even Heizi. Near the end of summer break, Kiki had to go back to Shanghai. Since neither of my parents were free that day, I took her to the train station. The two of us squeezed onto the train half an hour before departure time, and I made up my mind and took from my backpack a gift-wrapped parcel I had prepared ahead of time. Hesitantly, I said, this is a present for you. Kiki was surprised. What is it? Why don't you open it, later? No! But it was too late. Kiki had torn open the package and was staring wide-eyed at the copy of high-difficulty mathematical questions from the high school entrance examination with solutions and explanations. Well, you told me you had trouble with math, I struggled to explain. I like this book. I figured you might find it helpful. Kiki was laughing so hard that tears were coming out of her eyes. I felt like the world's biggest idiot. Whoever heard of giving a girl a test prep manual as a gift? Still laughing, Kiki opened the book to the title page. Her face froze as she read the Pushkin poem I had copied out. Life's deceits may fortune's fawning turn to scorn, yet as you grieve, do not anger, but believe in tomorrow's merry dawning. When your heart is rid at last of regret, despair, and fear, in the future, what has passed shall in kinder light appear. After the poem, I had written 2 lines. To my friend Zhao Qi, may you forget the unhappy parts of life and live each day in joy. Love life and embrace ideals. I felt very foolish. Kiki held the book to her chest and gave me a bright smile, but tears were spilling out of the corners of her eyes. Kiki left, and my life returned to its familiar routines. But my heart would not calm down. When Kiki visited, she brought a book called Season of Bloom, Season of Rain, which was popular among middle school girls back then. She had wrapped the book's cover carefully in poster paper and written the title on it in her neat, elegant handwriting. Curious, I had flipped through it but didn't find it interesting. Kiki left the book behind when she returned to Shanghai, and I hid it in the deepest recess of my desk because I was afraid Mom would take it away. The book still held Kiki's scent, and I pulled it out from time to time to read until I finished it. Afterward, I couldn't help but compare myself and Kiki to the high school students involved in the novel's complicated love triangles. Was I more like this guy or that one? Was Kiki more like this girl or that girl? One time, I brought up the topic with Heizi, and he almost died from laughing. Just because boys weren't into romance novels didn't mean we weren't interested in the mysterious emotions portrayed in them. Anything having to do with love was popular among my classmates. Everyone copied love poems, sang romantic ballads, and watched Divine Eagle, Gallant Lovers, imagining we were also star-crossed martial arts heroes and heroines. Matchmaking by astrology became a popular game. Once, one of the girls in my class, Shen Chan, and I were assigned classroom cleanup duty together, and somehow that inspired everyone to think of us as a couple. I vociferously denied this, not realizing that this only made the game even more fun for others. I resorted to ignoring Sun Chan altogether, but this only led all our classmates to postulate that we were having a lover's spat. I didn't know what to do. In the end, Sun Chan came to my rescue. She made no secrets of her interest in a high school boy, known for his wits and generated a ton of juicy gossip. As a result, rumors about Sun Chan and me naturally died out. Sun Chan's early attempt at romance soon ended when parents and teachers intervened, alarmed by this distraction from her academic development. Afterward, she acted aloof and cold to all of us, but spent her time reading books that appeared profound and abstruse. Contemplative essays about Chinese culture, collected works of obscure philosophy, and the like. Everyone now said that Sun Chan was going to become a famous writer. However, her class compositions often took original and rebellious points of view that led to criticism from the teachers. Despite the rumors about us, I didn't grow closer to Sun Chan. Instead, I became even more convinced of the depth of my feelings for Kiki. I thought, she might not be the prettiest girl and she's far away in Shanghai, but I like her, and I'm going to be good to her. Unfortunately, with thousands of kilometers dividing us, I only heard news about her from occasional phone calls between our mothers. After the divorce, Kiki lived with her mother, and though they were poor, Kiki did well academically and managed to place into one of the best high schools in the city. Oh, one more thing. During my middle school years, a short man named Deng Xiaoping rose to prominence and became a member of the Central Committee. Although Jiang Zemin was still the General Secretary, Deng held all the real power. Then started a series of reforms aimed at nationalizing industry, and he justified his politics with many novel theories. Socialism with Chinese characteristics. It doesn't matter whether it is a white cat or a black cat. A cat that catches mice is a good cat. And so on. Lots of people became rich by taking advantage of the new opportunities, but many others sank into poverty. Because the economy was doing so poorly, the small company Dad worked for had to shut down. But with the Deng-initiated reforms, he got a job with a state-owned enterprise that guaranteed we'd at least have the basic necessities. Honestly, compared to the rest of the world, China wasn't doing too badly. For example, I heard there was a financial crisis in Southeast Asia that affected the world. Russia's economy collapsed and even college students had to become streetwalkers. There was a civil war in Yugoslavia and a genocide in Africa. The United States had pulled out of Iraq but maintained a blockade and sanctions. None of this had much to do with my life, of course. The most important things in my life were studying, cramming for the college entrance examination, and sometimes thinking about Kiki. During my first year in high school, many people had pen pals, strangers they corresponded with. This wasn't all that different from the web-based chats we used to have when we were little, but the practice seemed a bit more literary. I missed Kiki so much that I decided to write her a letter in English, full of grammatical errors, as you might imagine, with the excuse that I was doing so to improve my English skills. Email would have been easier, but computers had disappeared from daily life, and so I had no choice but to write an actual letter. As soon as I dropped it into the mailbox, I regretted my rash act, but it was too late. The following 2 weeks crept by so slowly they felt like years. Kiki answered. She certainly made more of that English immersion kindergarten experience than I had. Her letter was much better. Leaving aside the content, even her handwriting was pretty, like a series of notes on a musical score. I had to read that letter with a dictionary by my side. I ended up practically memorizing it. I did feel my English improved a great deal as a result. Kiki's letter was pretty short, just over a page. She mentioned that the math book I had given her more than a year earlier had been helpful, and she was grateful. She also recommended new concept English to me, and told me some simple facts about her school. But I was most pleased by her last paragraph, in which she asked about my school, Heizi, and so on. Her meaning couldn't be clearer. She was looking forward to another letter from me. We corresponded in English regularly after that. We never said anything all that interesting. School, ideals in life, things like that. But the very fact that we were writing to each other made me incredibly happy. Just knowing that someone far away, practically on the other side of the world, was thinking about you and cared about you was an indescribably wonderful feeling. Kiki told me that her mother had gotten married again. Her stepfather had a child of his own and it was rather cool to her. She didn't feel that her home was her home anymore, and wanted to leave for college as soon as possible so that she could be independent. I finished high school without much trouble and did really well on my college entrance examination, so I could pick from several schools. Summoning my courage, I called Kiki and asked her what school she was picking. She said she didn't want to stay in Shanghai and filled out Nanjing University with a major in English as her first choice. I wanted to go to Nanjing as well. 1, I wanted to be with Kiki, and 2, I wanted to be away from my parents and try to make it on my own. But my parents absolutely would not allow it and insisted that I stay in Beijing. We had a huge fight, but in the end I gave in and filled out Peking University with a major in Chinese as my top choice. Hates never made it into a good high school and couldn't get into college at all, so he joined a department store as a sales clerk. Still, all of us believed that we had bright futures ahead of us. Compared to the close supervision we were under back in high school, college was practically total freedom. Although the school administrators, in local parenthesis, weren't keen on the idea of students dating, they basically looked the other way. Boys and girls paired up quickly, and the Chinese department was known as a hotbed of romance. Several of my roommates soon had beautiful girlfriends, and I was very envious. Sun Chan also got into Peking University, majoring in politics. Our high school classmates all predicted we would end up together, but Sun Chan soon published some outrageous poems and articles in the school paper and became part of the artsy, literary, avant-garde crowd. Other than occasionally seeing each other at gatherings of old high school friends, she and I ran in completely different circles. Kiki and I continued our correspondence, but we no longer needed writing in English as an excuse. We wrote to each other every week, and our letters ran on for dozens of pages, covering everything silly, interesting, or even boring in our lives. Sometimes I had to use extra stamps. I really wanted to make our relationship formal, but just couldn't get up the courage. By the time we were second years, the name of some boy began to appear in Kiki's letters. She mentioned him so casually, without even explaining who he was, as though he was already a natural part of her life. I asked her about him, and Kiki wrote back saying he was the class president, handsome, fluent in English, and also in the drama club with her. Unhappy with her response, I tried to draft a reply but couldn't find the words. I would have pulled out my cell phone to call her, but by then no one used cell phones anymore. China Mobile had long since gone out of business, and the cell phone on my desk, a beautiful present from my father when I turned 10, was just a useless piece of antique junk. I went downstairs to use the public phone. Every residential hall had only one phone, and the woman who picked up on the other end was the matron for Kiki's residential hall. She interrogated me for a long while before she agreed to get Kiki. I waited and waited. One of Kiki's roommates eventually picked up. Kiki is out with her boyfriend. I dropped the phone and ran to the train station to buy a ticket to Nanjing. I was at the door of her residential hall at noon the next day. Kiki came down the stairs like a graceful bird in a white pleated skirt, her hair tied back in neat braids. She appeared to be glowing with the warm sunlight. Other than a few pictures through the mail, we hadn't seen each other since that summer in middle school. She was no longer a girl, but a tall, vivacious young woman. She didn't look too surprised to see me. Instead, she lowered her eyes and chuckled, as though she knew I would be here. That afternoon, she took me to the famous No Sorrow Lake, where we rented a boat and rowed it to the center of the jade-green water. She asked me whether I had seen a popular Japanese TV drama called Tokyo Love Story. I had heard about the show, but since my roommates and I didn't own a TV, I had only seen some clips when I visited my parents and read some summaries in the TV guide. But I didn't want to show my ignorance. Yes, I said. So, who do you like? Kiki asked, very interested. I like Satomi. Honestly, I wasn't even sure who the characters were. Kiki was surprised. Satomi? I can't stand her. Why do you like her? My heart skipped a beat. Satomi is the female lead, right? She has such a pretty smile. What are you talking about? The female lead is Rika Anaka. Wait, I read the synopsis and they said that Satomi grew up with a male lead and then the two of them ended up together. Doesn't that make her the female lead? That's ludicrous, Kiki laughed. I loved the way she wrinkled her nose. Why would you think such a thing? Because I feel that people who knew each other when they were young ought to end up together. For example, I couldn't continue. For example? She grinned. You and me, I blurted out. Kiki tilted her head and looked at me for a while. What a silly idea. She slapped me. It wasn't a real slap, of course. It was so light it was more like a caress. Her slender fingers slid across my face, and I shriveled as though they were charged with electricity. My heart leapt wildly, and I grabbed her hand. Kiki didn't pull away. I stood up and wanted to pull her into an embrace, except I had forgotten we were on a boat, and so... The boat capsized, and as Kiki screamed, we tumbled into the water. We giggled like fools as we climbed back into the boat. Kiki was now my girlfriend. Later, she told me that the class president was really interested in her, but she had never cared for him. She wrote about him in her letters to me on purpose to see if she could finally get me to express myself clearly. She didn't quite anticipate that I would be so worried I'd come all the way to Nanjing. As she said this, I could tell how pleased she was. We held hands and visited all the big tourist attractions of Nanjing that day. Shuangwu Lake, Qinhui River, Confucian Temple, Sun Yat-sen's mausoleum. I spent the day in a honey-flavored daze. For the remainder of our time in college, we only got to see each other occasionally during breaks, but we wrote to each other even more often and were completely in love. My parents, after finding out about Kiki and me, were pleased because of the friendship between our families. Mom spoke of Kiki as her future daughter-in-law and joked that she and Kiki's mother had arranged for our marriage before we were even born. We planned to find jobs in the same city after graduation and then get married. Just as happiness appeared to be within reach, it shattered into a million pieces. The economies of Russia, Ukraine, and some other countries collapsed so completely that the unimaginable happened. A man named Gorbachev emerged as a powerful leader and convinced more than a dozen independent states to join together to form a new country called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, dedicated to the implementation of socialism. The new country became very powerful very quickly and thwarted the Americans at every turn, instantly adding tension to the international situation. The Soviet Union then encouraged revolutions in Eastern Europe, and even Germany, whose eastern and western halves weren't at the same level of economic development, split into two countries, with East Germany joining the Soviet bloc. In China, Deng's planned economic reforms weren't successful, and the economy continued to deteriorate. More and more people grew unhappy with the government. The machinery of the state was corrupt, ossified, authoritarian, and full of misadministration. College students still remembered how prosperous and strong the country had been when they were children, and comparing the past to the present filled them with rage. Rumors were full of tales of corrupt officials, of misappropriation of state funds for private gain, of attempts to fill public administration posts with family members and loyal minions, although few could explain clearly the root causes of the problems. Everyone appeared to agree on the solution to debates and discussions. The country was in trouble, and the political system had to be fundamentally reformed to implement a real democracy. The incompetent leaders had to go. A political manifesto composed some 20 years earlier, simply called Charter 08, began to spread secretly among college students. Right before my graduation, the factional struggles within the Communist Party grew even more intense. It was said that the leader of the reformists, Zhao Ziyang, has been relieved of his duties and placed under house arrest. The news was like the spark that set off a powder keg, and the long-repressed rage among the population erupted in a way that shocked everyone. Students at all the major universities in Beijing went into the streets to march and protest, and with the support of Beijing citizens, they occupied Tiananmen Square, which drew the attention of the world. A city of tents sprouted in the square, and some protesters even erected a statue of the Goddess of Liberty in front of the gates of heavenly peace itself. The drafter of Charter 08, Lu Xiaobo, returned to China from overseas. He made a speech at the square vowing to go on a hunger strike until there was true reform. The whole nation was inspired. Young people began to arrive from everywhere in China, and the mass movement gained momentum. Even ordinary citizens in Beijing mobilized to support the students. Heizi, for example, often came by on his tricycle to bring us food and water. "Eat and drink," he shouted. "You need your strength to fight those fucking bums sitting in Zongnanhai." Sun Chan had published some provocative essays in the past, and she was a fan of Lu Xiaobo. Her influence among the students made her one of the leaders in the movement. She came by to discuss with me how to motivate the students in the Chinese department to play a more active role. Stimulated by her fervor, I felt I had to do something for the country, and in the famous triangular plaza at the heart of Peking University's campus, I made a speech denouncing the corrupt, bureaucratic Students' Council and calling for all students to free themselves from government's control and to form a democratic, independent, self-governing body. Amazingly, many professors and students applauded my speech, and a few days later the Students' Autonomous Federation came into existence. Sun Chan was elected one of the standing committee members, and because she felt I had some talent, she asked me to join the Federation's publicity department. Thus, I became a core member of the movement. I felt as though my talents had been finally properly recognized. We created a command center in the square where our daily routines resembled those of a mini-government, receiving students' representatives from all over the country, announcing various proclamations and programs, issuing open letters, and engaging in vigorous debates over everything as though the future of the entire nation depended on us. News that our compatriots in Hong Kong and Taiwan were also supporting us and donating funds filled us with even more zeal. We laughed, we cried, we screamed, we sang, all the while dreaming of forging a brand new future for China with our youth and passion. One day, at the beginning of June, I was in a crude tent at the edge of the command center writing a new program for the movement. The weather was hot and humid, and I was drenched in sweat. Suddenly, I heard Shen Chan call out, "Baoshu, look who's here to see you." I emerged from the tent. Kiki was standing there in a sky-blue dress, carrying a small pack on her back and looking tired from her journey. Overcome by joy and surprise, I couldn't speak, and Sun Chan made fun of us. Since Sun Chan had never met Kiki before, she gave her a careful once-over and said, "So this is Baoshu's mysterious girlfriend." Kiki blushed. Finally, after getting rid of Sun Chan, I peppered Kiki with questions. "How did you get here? Did you come with other students from Nanjing University?" "That's great. I heard about the protests in Nanjing too. Who's in charge of your group? I've just drafted a new program for the movement, and it would be useful to get some feedback." "Is that all you have to say to me after all this time?" Kiki interrupted. "Of course not. I've really missed you." I hugged her, laughing, but soon turned serious again. But the movement is running out of steam and the students are splitting into factions. The hunger strike isn't sustainable, and I've been discussing with Liu Xiaobo how to develop the movement and extend it. Come, take a look at my draft. Baoshu, Kiki interrupted again. I stopped by your home. Your mother asked me to come and talk to you. A bucket of cold water had been poured onto the fire in me. Oh, I said, and nothing more. Your mother is really worried about you. Kiki's voice was gentle. It's almost time for you to receive your post-graduation job assignment. You know how important that is. Stop messing around with these people. Come home with me. Kiki, how can you say such a thing? I was disappointed as well as angry. Messing around. Look at the tens of thousands of students assembled in the square. Look at the millions of citizens beyond them. All of Beijing, no, all of China has boiled over. Everyone is fighting for the future of our country. How can we go back to studying in a classroom? What can you possibly accomplish? You'll never overcome the government. They have the army. Also, some of your proposals are too radical. They're impossible. What do you mean impossible? I was very unhappy with her. The army serves the people. The soldiers will never point their guns at us. Some of the students are talking to them already. Don't worry, I've heard that the bureaucrats in the central leadership are terrified. They'll soon be willing to compromise. Kiki sighed and sat down, looking miserably at me. We talked and talked, but there was no resolution. In the end, I refused to leave the square, and Kiki stayed with me. That night, we slept in the same tent. We talked about the national and international situation and the movement's prospects, but we couldn't agree on anything and started to argue. Eventually, we stopped talking about these matters and simply held each other. We reminisced about our childhood together, and then I could no longer hold back. I kissed her, first her face, then her lips. That was the first time we really kissed. Her lips were soft and chapped, which broke my heart. I kissed her deeply and would not let go. In the dark, it happened naturally. With so many young people in the square, our lovemaking was an open secret. Normally, I despised such behavior and felt that couples who engaged in it tarnished the sacred nature of our protest. But now that it was happening to me, I couldn't resist and felt our actions were a natural part of the movement itself. Maybe some nameless anxiety about the future also made us want to seize this last moment of total freedom. Every motion, every gesture was infused with awkwardness and embarrassment. We were clumsy and raw. The passion, the irresistible power of youthful passion eventually brought that fumbling, ridiculous process to a conclusion of sweet intimacy that surpassed understanding. The next day, we heard the news that troops had arrived just outside Beijing to enforce martial law. A vanguard had already entered the city, preparing to clear the square. Should we retreat? The command center held a meeting and options were divided. Liu Xiaobo advocated retreat to prevent the loss of lives. Due to Kiki's influence, I also supported Liu's suggestion. But the commander-in-chief, Cha Ling, was indignant and refused to budge. She even called us cowards and said that we must resist to the utmost, even with our lives. Her words inspired all the other attendees, and those advocating retreats were silenced. In the end, most of the students stayed to follow Cha Ling's orders. That night was especially hot. Kiki and I couldn't fall asleep, so we lay outside the tent, whispering to each other. You were right, I said. Cha Ling's too stubborn. I don't think any good will come of this. I'll tell Liu Xiaobo tomorrow that we're going home. All right. She leaned her head against my shoulder and fell asleep. I followed soon after. I startled awake with the noise of the crowd all around me. The stars in the summer sky overhead were eerily bright. It took me a moment to realize that all the lamps on the square were extinguished and darkness engulfed us, which is why the stars shine so bright and clear. People were shouting all around us and loudspeakers squawked. I couldn't understand what was going on. Baoshu! Someone ran at us with a flashlight, and the glare made me squint. A blurry figure came closer. Sun Chan. She was sobbing as she said, Hurry! You have to leave! The army is clearing the square! What? Where's Cha Ling? She was supposed to be in charge. That bitch was the first to run away. Go, go. I still have to find Lu Xiaobo. Later, I found that a large number of armed police had come into the square with batons to break down the tents, beating any students who resisted. But we couldn't see anything at the time, and everything around us was utter chaos. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed Kiki by the hand and tried to follow the flow of the crowd. A few students from the provinces ran past us screaming, "Tanks! Tanks! Someone got crushed by the tanks!" They collided into us and separated Kiki from me. I heard Kiki calling my name and ran toward her, shouting her name, but I tripped over a tent and couldn't get up for some seconds while others ran over me, kicking me back down. By the time I finally struggled up, I could no longer hear Kiki and didn't know where she was. Helpless, I tried to continue in the same direction I'd been headed. A chaotic crowd surrounded me, but there was no Kiki. I screamed her name, then someone started singing the Internationale, and everyone joined in. I couldn't even hear my own voice. Caught up in the tumultuous crowd, I left Tiananmen Square. In this manner, we were forcefully removed from the square. At least no shots were fired. However, elsewhere in the city, there were more violent encounters between the army and the protesters, and gunshots were heard from time to time. I returned home, hoping against hope, but Kiki had not been there. Ignoring the objections of my parents, I ran back toward the city center. By then it was dawn, and scattered tanks and soldiers could be seen in the streets. Bloody corpses lined the roads, many of them young students. I felt as though I was in the middle of a battlefield, and terror seized me. But the idea that something had happened to Kiki terrified me even more. Like a crazy man, I looked everywhere for her. At noon, I ran into one of my friends from the command center. He brought me to a secret gathering where I found Sun Chan and Lu Xiaobo. Many were wounded, and Sun Chan, her face drenched of blood, shivered as Lu held her. I asked them if they had seen Kiki. Sun Chan started to sob. My heart sank into an icy abyss. Tearfully, Sun Chan explained that Kiki had found them as the square was being cleared, and they retreated together. They encountered a column of soldiers at an intersection, and not fully understanding the situation, they denounced the soldiers. The soldiers responded by firing upon them, and a few of the students fell. They turned to run again, only realizing after a while that Kiki was no longer with them. Shen retraced their steps and found Kiki lying in a pool of blood, not moving. They had wanted to save Kiki, but the soldiers were chasing them, and they had no choice but to keep running. She was sobbing so hard by now that she could no longer speak. I demanded that Chan tell me the exact location and then dashed madly toward the address. At the intersection, I saw the smoking, burnt remnant of an army truck. Inside was the charred corpse of a soldier. In a pool of blood next to the intersection lay a few more bodies, but I didn't see Kiki. Forcing down my nausea, I searched all around, though I was hoping to find nothing. But then I saw Kiki's sky-blue dress under one of the wheels of the army truck. Blood had stained it purple, and protruding from the skirt was a section of her perfect calf, ending in a bloody mess. Shivering, I approached. An overwhelming stench of blood filled my nose. I felt the sky and the earth spin around me and could no longer stand up. Everything was speeding away from me, leaving only an endless darkness that descended over me, extinguishing my last spark of consciousness. By the time I woke up, it was dark again. I heard the sound of occasional gunshots in the distance. A column of soldiers passed no more than 2 meters from me, but they ignored me, probably thinking I was just another corpse. I lay still, stunned, and for a moment I forgot what had happened, until the terrifying memory returned and crushed me with despair. I couldn't blame Chaling or the students who had run into Kiki and me and separated us from each other, or even the soldiers. I knew that the real culprit responsible for Kiki's death was me, because I didn't listen to her. That night, I became a walking corpse. I dared not look at Kiki's body again. Wandering the city on my own, I paid no attention to the fearsome soldiers or the criminals who took advantage of the chaos to loot and rob. Several times I saw people fall down near me and die, but somehow, miraculously, I was spared. The world had turned into a nightmare from which I could not awaken. The next day, as a long column of tanks rolled down the avenue of eternal peace, I stepped in front of them. Passers-by watched, stunned, and wanted the tanks to crush me beneath their treads. But I didn't die. Plainclothes officers grabbed me and pulled me off the street. I was thrown into a dark room and interrogated for a few days. By then I had recovered some of my senses and managed to tell them what had happened. I was certain I would be sentenced to death or at least be locked away for years. My heart had already died, and I didn't care. Unexpectedly, after a few months of detention, I was released without even a trial. My punishment was quite light. Expulsion from Peking University. By the time I was released, order had been restored. After the violence crackdown that ended the protests, the governments became unexpectedly magnanimous. General Secretary Jiang stepped down, and although Deng Xiaoping retained power, the reformist Zhao Ziyang became the new general secretary, and another reformist leader with a good reputation, Hu Yaobang, also took an important political post. Most of the participants in the protests were not punished. Even Liu Xiaobo was continued to continue teaching at a university, though he was no longer be permitted to leave the country. The government's final summary of the protests was this: the university students made legitimate demands. However, international forces took advantage of them. Supposedly, the international forces were working against the entire socialist camp, not just China. They stirred up trouble in Eastern Europe too, hoping to encircle and contain the Soviet Union. In the end, the Western powers failed utterly in this plan. The Soviet Union not only survived, but also installed socialist governments in Czechoslovakia, Poland, and several other Eastern European countries. These satellites formed the Warsaw Pact with the Soviet Union to counteract the power of NATO. The US and the USSR thus began a Cold War. After my release from prison, Kiki's mother came to her home and demanded to know where her daughter was. During the interim months, she had almost gone mad with the lack of any news about Kiki. She came to Beijing only to find that I had been locked up as well. I fell to my knees in front of her and tearfully confessed that I was responsible for Kiki's death. At first she refused to believe me, but then she kicked me and beat me until my parents pulled her off. She collapsed to the ground and sobbed inconsolably. Kiki's mother never forgave me, and she broke off all contact with my family. Later, I went to Shanghai a few times, but she refused to see me. I heard that she had fallen on hard times, and I tried to send her some money and necessities, but she always returned my packages unopened. On the day of Kiki's death, my mental state had broken down so completely that I didn't even remember to collect her body. Now it was too late even to give her a decent burial. No doubt she had been cremated en masse with the other unclaimed corpses. A spirited young woman in the spring of her life had disappeared from the world, and it was as if she had never existed. No, that was not quite true. I did find a purple hair clip in my pocket. I remembered Kiki taking it off the nights we were in the tents together, and I had pocketed it without thinking. This was my last memento of her. I found everything in my home that held memories of Kiki and put them together on the desk. The hair clip, bundles of letters, little presents we had given each other, a few photographs of the two of us, and that copy of Season of Bloom, Season of Rain. Every day I sat in front of this shrine and tried to relive all the moments we had shared, as though she was still by my side. I spent half a year like this. Maybe I had gone a bit mad. At the Spring Festival, as the family gathered for New Year's dinner, my mother broke down in tears. She said she couldn't bear to see me like this. She wanted me to stop living in the past and go on with my life. I sat at the table dully for a long while. I steeled myself and carefully packed up all the objects on my desk and placed them at the bottom of my trunk. I kept the bundle with me always, but seldom looked at those mementos again. Life had to go on, and I did not want to experience that heart-rending pain and sense of guilt anew. Though I was expelled from school, General Secretary Zhao indicated that he was interested in a more enlightened administration that would let bygones be bygones. And the professors in my department who sympathized with my plight managed to give me my diploma through back channels. I couldn't find a job, though. When I was younger, companies recruited on campus for graduates, but after the reforms, all jobs were assigned by the state. Since my record was stained by my participation in the protests, I was no longer part of the system and no job would be assigned to me. Heizi had also lost his job because of his support for the students. The two of us got together and figured we'd try our luck at starting a business. Back then, Zhao Ziyang was pushing through price reforms aimed at addressing the transition from market economy to planned economy, and the prices for everything had skyrocketed. Everybody around the country was hoarding, and life was becoming harder for the average person. Since many everyday goods were in short supply, the government started to issue ration tickets for food, clothing, and so on, to limit the amount anyone could purchase. If we were clever and bought and sold goods at the right times, we stood to make a good profit. Heizi and I planned to go to Guangdong in the south, which is more developed than the rest of China. Although my parents didn't want me to be so far away from home, they were glad to see me trying to get my life back on track and gave us their life savings as starting capital. There were many opportunities in those days, and Heizi and I quickly brought some t-shirts back to Beijing, which we sold at a significant markup. Not only did we recoup all our capital, we even managed to make tens of thousands in profit. And thus we became two so-called profiteers who traveled all over China searching for opportunities. Sometimes Heizi and I struck gold, but other times we were so poor we didn't know where our next meal would come from. After spending a few years traveling around and interacting with all segments of society, I realized how immature we had been back at Tiananmen. China was an overladen freight train burdened with the weight of the past as well as the present. A few students fervently shouting slogans could not change the complicated conditions of the country. But how might things be improved? I had no answers. All I knew was that although China had recovered its tranquility and the people appeared to be focused only on the concerns of daily life, there were strong currents and countercurrents of competing social interests. Together, they formed a powerful hidden whirlpool that might pull the nation into an abyss that no one wanted to see. Yet the process wasn't something that could be controlled by anyone or any authority. No one could control history. We were all simply parts of a great vortex that was greater than any individual. Two years after Heizi and I started our business, I bumped into Shen Qian while searching for something to buy in Guangzhou. After the protests, I stayed away from the literary elites and rarely got to see her, although I had heard that she had become Liu Xiaobo's lover. Although Liu was married, Shen Qian was willing to be his mistress because she truly loved him. Later, the rumor said Louis had divorced his wife, and I thought he would marry Shen Qian. I certainly didn't expect to find her so far from Beijing. Meeting an old friend a long way from home always made me emotional. Reminded of Kiki, I felt my eyes grow wet. Shen Qian told me that she had arrived in Guangzhou hoping to stay with an old friend and get back on her feet, but the friend was nowhere to be found and she didn't know what to do. I promised I'd help her. I took Shen Qian to a restaurant to welcome her to Guangzhou. We talked about the old times, but both of us avoided any mention of Tiananmen. After a few rounds of drinks, Shen Qian's lips loosened and she told me tearfully how Liu Xiaobo had taken advantage of her trust. He had promised to divorce his wife and marry her, but she caught him with another student. They had a fight and broke up. As she told her story, she kept on drinking, straight from the bottle, and I couldn't stop her. Later, she began to sing loudly, and everybody in the restaurant stared at us. I quickly paid the bill and hurried her out of there. Sun Chan was so drunk that I had to hold her up. Since she had nowhere else to stay, I brought her back to my room. I left her to recover in my bed while I slept on the floor. The next morning, I needed to get out early to browse the markets, so I left without waking up Sun Chan. By the time I got back, I expected she would be gone. However, when I came in the door, I saw that my messy room had been cleaned up and everything was neat and logically arranged. There was a new cloth on the small kitchen table, and Sun Chan, in an apron, was carrying a plate of steaming scrambled eggs with tomatoes out of the kitchen. We looked at each other. She smiled shyly. I knew that my life was about to start a new chapter. Sun Chan continued to stay in my rental unit. She made the place feel like home, a feeling I had long missed. And so the two of us, both with pasts that we wanted to forget, leaned against each other for warmth. Heizi had just gotten married, and after finding out that Sun Chan and I were together, he was very happy for us. He treated Sun Chan as though we were already married. Since Sun Chan couldn't find a job, she helped us with our business. She was nothing like the young, radical student rebel she had been. After all she had gone through, she had abandoned her dreams of revolutions and literary fame and turned all her attention to family. Who is to say this wasn't a self as true as her former image? Half a year later, my mom came to Guangzhou for a visit, and my relationship with Sun Chan could no longer be kept a secret. My mother didn't like Sun Chan at first, but after living with us for a while, she began to accept this future daughter-in-law and urged us to get married. Society was turning more conservative by then, and since we were no longer so young, we returned to Beijing to apply for a marriage license. At our wedding, a few old classmates joked that they always knew we would end up together. After a year, Sun Chan gave birth to our son, Xiaobao. The wounds of our past were gradually healing. Though I couldn't say we were happy or that everything was perfect, our life wasn't without warmth or simple pleasures. The leadership in Beijing was now deepening the economic reforms and gradually pushing planned economy to displace the market. One of the policies was a dual price system, which involved one price for goods set by the economic planning authorities and another price set by the market. Many officials with the right connections could become official profiteers by buying goods at the low planned economy price and selling them on the market at an enormous profit. Low-level peddlers like Heizi and me, on the other hand, suffered due to our lack of connections. Business became harder and harder. One time, we managed to acquire a bunch of color televisions, but the official profiteers were a step ahead of us and cornered the market. We had no choice but to sell at a loss. We ended up owing a bunch of money and had to close up shop and head back to Beijing. One of Heizi's uncles was a shift foreman at a factory, and he managed to get Heizi a job as a driver there. By carrying private goods for people on official trips, Heizi made good money. I couldn't find any such opportunity, and I was exhausted after years spent struggling in business. I decided to return to university and began to prepare to take the examination for graduate school. As a graduate of Peking University, I thought the exam would be a piece of cake. But after being away from a classroom for so many years, it wasn't easy to get back into the right mindset. I took the exam 2 years in a row and couldn't pass. Since Xiaobao was getting older and our savings was nearing depletion, we relied on help from my parents. Sun Chan family managed to get a job at a newspaper, which at least guaranteed us a base salary and benefits like housing and healthcare. Then she began to complain about my lack of accomplishments. Look at you. When we got together, I thought you had some business savvy and might make it big. But in the end, you're just a bookworm who can't even manage to get into grad school. The Chinese women's volleyball team has won the world championship 3 times, which is as many as you'd failed. Faced with this nagging tirade, I felt lost. What had happened to that passionate, idealistic, revolutionary leader I once knew? Of course, I knew that wasn't Shen Qian's fault. This was what happened after life subjected us to its endless grind. The world wasn't a fairy tale or the setting for an adventure. Even if it were, we would not be the protagonists. No matter what ideals and hopes we once harbored, the most we could hope to accomplish in the end was to survive. Since I was feeling low during that time, I sought refuge in fiction and got into wuxia fantasies. The remake of Legend of the Condor Heroes, produced in Hong Kong, was very popular on TV. I had seen an older version when I was little, but thought the remake was better, even though the budget clearly wasn't as big. I borrowed wuxia books by Jin Yong, Gu Long, Lian Wusheng. I would have read Huang Yi's books too, but I couldn't find them anywhere. Xiao Bao was now old enough that he spent every day practicing 18 stages to subdue a dragon, along with the heroes on TV. Sun Qian got mad and told me that I was rotting our child's mind. I had to switch to reading something else. Science fiction was also popular. Ye Yongli's little Know-It-All Roams the Future sold millions of copies, and Zheng Wuguang's Tower Sagittarius was flying off the shelves. I gradually became a fan. Only science fiction could liberate me from the weight of daily life and allow me to enjoy a little pleasure. It was too bad that there were so few Chinese science fiction books, and not many foreign works were being translated. I soon finished all the ones I could find. Inspired by my reading, I tried my hand at writing and ended up with a book called Little Know-It-All Roams the Universe, which was a sequel to Ye Yongli's famous book. At first, I passed the draft among friends, but then I got to know a young man named Yao Haizheng who helped me obtain Mr. Yi's permission and found me a publisher. The story gained me a bit of fame, and I was called a rising star of science fiction. Encouraged, I wrote another book called Little Know-It-All Roams the Body, which was meant to teach readers some interesting facts about the human body. Unfortunately, this book caused a lot of controversy. Some argued that I was stealing too much from Ye Yongli. Some suggested that I was tarnishing Chinese science fiction with portrayals that encouraged lascivious thoughts. Still others claimed that my work was an example of capitalist liberalism and contained metaphors criticizing the Communist Party. I was writing at a fairly turbulent time when ideological debates were on the rise. There were even sporadic student movements again. The central leadership probably wanted to create the opportunity for another purge, so they initiated an effort to cleanse society of spiritual pollution. I became a target and was severely criticized. Luckily, the government wasn't interested in having the pollution cleaning spin out of control, and I wasn't punished much. However, it was impossible for me to be published anymore. I had to go back to the textbooks and prepare for the graduate school examination again. It was only later that I understood how fortunate I had been. The country was also undergoing a movement of intensive crackdown. This involved every aspect of life. Purse snatchers were handed death sentences, while public dancing carried a charge of indecency. Lu Xiaobo found himself in trouble because he had several lovers and was executed by this firing squad. When she heard the news, Sun Qian was depressed for a long time. After the intensive crackdown, society grew even more conservative. Many things that used to be common became crimes. Cohabitating without being married, kissing in public, wearing revealing clothes, and so forth. Given the shift in mainstream culture, I dare not write about sensitive areas again. Thus did my career as an author come to an end. Just as weal can lead to woe, misfortune can also lead to lucky breaks. A prominent professor turned out to be a fan of my novels and specifically requested me during the admission process. As a result, I became his graduate student and returned to school the next year. At my mentor and advisor's suggestion, I chose Sartre's existentialism as my topic. Although many people had been studying it, most explanations were half-baked. After so many years wasted drifting in society, I treasured the opportunity to study in depth. I read many foreign books in the original languages, taught myself French, and published a few papers that were well received. Eventually, with my advisor's recommendation, I was given the precious opportunity to study overseas at a famous university in America at the government's expense. This was the first and last time in my life I lived outside China. Visiting this country on the other side of the Pacific that people both loved and hated was quite an experience. The university was in New York, the greatest city on earth. When I was little, I saw a ton of TV shows and movies set in New York. Beijinger in New York, Godzilla, and I had long wanted to visit. The sights and sounds of the city, skyscrapers, overpasses, highways, subways, were overwhelming. I remember the Beijing of my childhood as a prosperous city comparable to New York. But for some reason, after a few decades, New York remained a modern metropolis while Beijing had declined precipitously. I saw in America many goods that had long ceased to be findable in China. Coca-Cola, KFC, Nescafe. These were the brands I grew up with, and I'd indulged in a bit of nostalgia. I finally understood why so many people preferred to leave China for the US and not return. However, I could also see signs that America was on the decline. At the time of my visits, a new blockbuster had just been released. Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope. I remember seeing episodes 1 through 3 when I was little and had always wanted to find out what would happen next. To re-experience the wonder of my childhood memories, I bought an expensive ticket. But episode 4 turned out to be far less spectacular than the previous 3, and the special effects were so bad that you could almost see the strings on the spaceships. I was really disappointed. Apparently, the Cold War had drained America's resources into the arms race, and the economy wasn't doing so well. Unlike in the past, opportunities for exchanges between America and China were growing scarce. It was almost impossible to visit America on your own, and even government-sponsored trips were rare. There were only a handful of Chinese from the mainland in the entire university. To celebrate my arrival, they held a party for me, and as we enjoyed our French fries, they asked me how things were in China. Since it took almost a full month for international mail to reach the recipient and phone calls were extremely inconvenient, they got most of their information about China from English language news reports, which tended to be so narrow in scope that it was like trying to understand a beach by observing a few pebbles. We reminisced about how when we were little we could chat with friends on the other side of the globe just by opening a window over the web, and it felt like another age, another world. While we were discussing rumors about the transition of power from Deng Xiaoping to Hua Guofeng, a dark horse about whom little was known, the doorbell rang. A woman stood up and said, "Oh, it must be so-and-so," but I didn't catch the name. She went and opened the door and a woman came in, limping with the aid of a cane. I gave her a curious glance, and when I saw her face, I froze. She looked at me, unable to speak. It was a dream. A dream. Kiki. My Kiki. In a moment, everything around me, no, the entire universe disappeared. Only Kiki and I remained between heaven and earth. We gazed at each other, our eyes saying what our lips could not. Fates had played a cruel game with us. After the trials and tribulations of more than 10 years, we had found each other again on the other side of the Pacific. Trembling, we came together and held on to each other for dear life. Tears poured from our eyes as sobs racked our bodies. The other realized that something extraordinary was happening and left so that we could be alone together. Kiki told me that when she was shot that night, she lost consciousness. When she woke up, she saw a car passing by and screamed for help. A few foreigners from the car came to her aid, but she passed out again. The car turned out to belong to an American news crew who planned to film a live report. But the danger of the situation had forced them to retreat, which was when they saw Kiki. They brought her back to the American embassy, where the embassy doctors dressed her wounds. Later, Kiki met Chai Ling and the others hiding in the embassy. They told her that I had died. Chai Ling and the rest were wanted by the authorities, and while Kiki was still recovering, their requests for political asylum was approved. Under the protection of the embassy, Kiki left Beijing, a city of sorrow, and came with the others to New York. At first, Kiki didn't know what conditions were like in China, and she dared not make contact with anyone in the country, lest they suffer as a result. After a few years, Kiki managed to return to Shanghai once to visit her mother, who told her that I have gotten married in Guangzhou. Not wanting to disturb my life, she told her mother not to let me know that she was still alive. The bullets had left her with a permanent handicap and deprived her of the ability to become a mother. Helpless in this country, she married an old man who abused her. After her divorce, she managed to apply for and win a scholarship and came to study in this university. We spent the whole nights recounting to each other our experiences during the intervening years, and we held each other and cried. What should have been the most wonderful decade of our lives had been lost to the vicissitudes of fate. I said, "I'm so sorry," countless times, but what was the use? I vowed to devote the rest of my life to making it up to her, to giving her the happiness that should have been hers. Naturally, ignoring the gossip, we moved in together. We barely spent any time apart, trying to make up for our lost youth. Kiki had her green card. As long as I stayed with her, I should be able to remain in the United States. Since conditions in China had deteriorated further and China was now engaged in a war with Vietnam, Kiki told me not to go back. But I couldn't just forget about Sun Chan and my son. Ever since I started grad school, Sun Chan had been living like a single mother, struggling to keep the whole family afloat, pinning her hopes on my success. To simply abandon her felt to me an unforgivable betrayal. Although Kiki and I had recovered some measure of our happiness, my heart was conflicted. But I was a coward. All I cared about was the joy of the present, and I dared not think about the choice I had to make. I stayed for more than a year in New York. After our lives had settled down somewhat, I threw myself into my work. I read many books of literary theory, politics, and philosophy, and felt my understanding grow by leaps and bounds. Often, I pushed Kiki's wheelchair and took walks with her in Battery Park, where we both gazed at the distant figure of the Statue of Liberty and debated the fate of China and the future of the world. My American advisor thought highly of my paper. He told me there was a teaching position open to those with a literary background that might be a good fit for me. If I got the job, I could stay and finish my PhD. Excited, I handed in my application right away. But then I received a letter from Sun Chan. There isn't a wall in the world that doesn't have a crack. Even divided by the Pacific, rumors about Kiki and me had managed to make their way back to China. Sun Chan was polite but firm in her letter, demanding an explanation. I finally decided to make a short trip back to China to clarify the situation with her. Kiki originally wanted to accompany me, but I asked her to stay put for now. Having her show up at the door with me might be too much for Sun Chan, and I wanted to talk to her alone. We said goodbye at the airport, and Kiki, in a bright green jacket, leaned against the railing with her cane and watched me go through border patrol. I turned back to look at her. Even decades later, the sights of her watching me, like the woman from that old legend who turned to stone waiting for her husband by the sea, would remain with me like a brand burned into my heart. Back in China, Sun Qian was happy to see me. She made no mention of the question she'd asked me in her letter. Wearing her apron, she busied herself about the kitchen preparing my favorite dishes, many of which were not available in the U.S. Sauteed shredded pork with soybean paste, pork with bamboo shoots, steamed chicken with mushrooms. At dinner, she didn't ask me about my life in the U.S. and only talked about the domestic news. Ration tickets were now required for most goods. Farmers were no longer allotted individual plots of land, but had to work collectively in communes. Her newspaper was in the middle of the debates about the proper authority for Marxist philosophy. Xiao Bao was playing at my feet, absolutely delighted with the toy robots I had bought him. Faced with my innocent son and tender wife, I just couldn't bring myself to say the word divorce. That night, as we lay in bed, Sun Qian held me and passionately kissed me. I could feel her body trembling. Steeling myself, I gently pushed her away. Qian, I need to tell you something. What's the rush? Her arms went around my neck again as she murmured. The night is still young. Why don't we first... I want a divorce. I blurted out before I lost my nerve. Her body stiffened. Stop it. That's not funny. I'm not kidding. Kiki is in America and we... I couldn't continue, but Sun Qian understood. You decided? She sat up. Yes. I understand. As she continued, her eyes flared with anger and her voice gradually grew harsh. I know you were living with Zhao Qi. I know you used to be a couple. I knew that 10 years ago. But what about me? What about all the years I put into this marriage, without me slaving away to take care of you and your son? Do you think you could have gotten the chance to leave China, to see your old lover? Now that you finally made it, do you think you can discard me like a pair of old shoes? No! Listen, I will make it up to you. I will pay... I had planned a whole pretty speech but couldn't remember any of the words. What I did say sounded so cold, so heartless. I was disgusted by my own hypocrisy and clumsiness. Sun Qian laughed mirthlessly. She slid off the bed and, without even putting on her shoes, headed out. Where are you going? It's the middle of the night. Afraid that she might leave the apartment, I got up as well. She went onto the balcony and locked the door behind her. She stood facing me with her hands behind her. Her white nightgown trembled with her breath, and she looked like a ghost in the night. I was terrified that she was going to jump. Don't, please, I begged. Let's talk about this. What are you afraid of? Sun Qian said mockingly. If I died, wouldn't that be perfect for you and Zhao Qi? Don't worry, I'm not going to grant your wish. She raised her arms and tossed something over the edge of the balcony. I saw pieces of paper drifting in the wind, falling like snowflakes. My passport and other documents. Behind me, Xiao Bao, who had been awakened by our argument, started to cry. Sun Qian left with Xiao Bao and went to her parents' home. The next day, her parents and uncle came to our place to scream at me, and I had no choice but to hide in my room. It was impossible to keep something like this secret, and soon all my neighbors and colleagues at the university had heard the news. The rumors mutated as they spread. Some were saying that I had found a wealthy, powerful woman overseas, and I was going to abandon my wife and child like one of those villains in the old folk operas. The denunciations were so oppressive that I couldn't even leave home without feeling fingers pointed at me behind my back. Even my mentor, for whom I had held deep respect and affection, gave me a tongue lashing, and I could say nothing in my defense. My father felt ill because of what was happening. This was how life made you helpless. If you try to swim against its currents, you will feel resistance at every step. I regretted coming back. It would have been easier if I had had the strength to stay overseas. But now it was impossible to leave. To replace my passport would require a great deal of paperwork, and now that my reputation was ruined, I couldn't even get a recommendation letter from my department. I was stuck. I lacked the strength to continue the struggle, yet I was unwilling to give up. It took half a year before the situation changed. In the end, as much as Shen Qian hated me, she wasn't going to shackle us together for the rest of our lives. She agreed to a divorce but demanded full custody of our son. I agreed, and also promised her monetary compensation. Finally, after everything was resolved, I placed a long-distance call to Kiki, and she was overjoyed by the news. Since I still couldn't leave the country for the time being, she said she would come back the next month so that we could get married in China and then leave together. I waited and waited for her flight, but it never arrived. The next month, the era of Mao Zedong began. For years, the government had been following a policy of buy rather than build. This created the false appearance of prosperity in the economy, but hollowed out China's industrial infrastructure. The gap between the wealthy and the poor grew, and anger at the government grew along with it. Everywhere, a spectre-like name haunted China, a name that grew gradually in prominence. People said, "This man will bring China fresh hope." He was called Mao Zedong. A few years earlier, he had held the post of Secretary of the Sichuan Provincial Committee in the provincial capital of Chongqing, and his various policies, known by the slogan, "Sing red songs, strike black forces," and involving this public displays of communist zeal and intensive government intervention, had made Chongqing into a prosperous city. Many ordinary citizens, especially poor peasants in the rural areas, supported him. The paramount leader of China, Hua Guofeng, was deeply influenced by Mao Zedong, and once Hua had gotten into power, he initiated the Great Proletariat's Cultural Revolution, which sought to mobilize the people to bring down the capitalist rulers within the Communist Party. The mass movement swept the entire country, and political power within China was redistributed overnight. Deng Xiaoping, Ye Jiangying, Hu Yaobang, and others in their faction all fell from prominence, and with the entire country behind him, Mao Zedong was elected chairman of the Communist Party. After he became the chairman, Mao continued the Cultural Revolution, focusing on criticizing Deng and opposing rightless tendencies, especially Deng's foreigner-slave political philosophy. He abolished Deng's policy of keeping China open to outside influences and essentially cut China off from the rest of the world. Soon after, the United States terminated all diplomatic relations with China. I could no longer go to America, and Kiki could not come to China. And so, once again, history divided us. During the early stages of the Cultural Revolution, the personality cult of Mao was extreme, but the movement itself wasn't too violent. With my mentor's recommendation, I became an instructor at the university after grad school. Although colleges were no longer admitting students and the social status of intellectuals had declined, it was at least possible to make a living by writing theory papers on Marxism and Leninism, criticizing traditional Confucian philosophy, and reinterpreting Chinese history through a communist lens as directed by the central leadership. The Cultural Revolution also interrupted the divorce proceedings, and so Sun Qian and I ended up living together again, doing our best to get along. Year after year, we went to work, we came home, and we studied the required political readings. The revolution was going well, as was proclaimed in public at every opportunity, but life itself had become as still as a pool of dead water. During those years, even bright-colored clothing was forbidden. No forms of culture or entertainment were permitted, since they were all corrupted by feudal American capitalist or Soviet revisionist influences, except for the 8 model revolutionary operas. One time, I found a dirty, ragged copy of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone abandoned in a public library, and tears filled my eyes. I took it home and read it in secret several times. But in the end, terrified of being accused of harboring contraband, I burned it. Sometimes, as I study the latest directives from the paramount leader, I would think, what happened to all the eras I have lived through? When I was a young man, the streets were packed with bell-bottoms and profiteers. When I was a teenager, TV dramas from Hong Kong and Taiwan filled the airwaves. When I was a child, it was possible to play games on the web, to go and see the latest movies from Hollywood, and there were the Olympics and 3D films. Did those times really exist? Where did they come from, and where have they gone? Or was all this just a dream? Maybe everything was simply a game played by time. What was time? What was there besides nothingness? Before us happened nothingness, and after us will be nothingness. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I thought of the woman I loved on the other shore of the Pacific, and pain racked my body. Those days when I was half mad with love, when I was a stranger in a strange land, they felt so real and yet so much like a fantasy. What would have happened if I had listened to Kiki and stayed in America? Would I be happier than now? Or would I simply be mired in an even deeper illusion? At least I would then be with the person I loved. In reality, America was no paradise either. The People's Daily explained that because the United States was addicted to militarism, and it had sunk into the quagmire of the Vietnam War. Racial conflicts with America were intensifying, and the crisis in the Middle East was causing an oil shortage. The capitalists were likely not going to last much longer, and American radical leftist movements were gaining momentum. The Soviets' camp, meanwhile, was growing stronger every day. The Cold War grew heated, and on almost every continent proxy wars were fought between the two superpowers. Ballistic nuclear submarines patrolled the sea depths, and every warhead they carried was capable of destroying an entire city. Even more missiles rested in their silos, awaiting the order that would launch them soaring through the air to rain destruction among us. Death itself roamed overhead, poised to send all of humanity into hell. Regardless of whether you were Chinese or American, you were headed for the same place. Sometimes, I recall the rumors about the end of the world from my childhood. Maybe the prophecy had come true, except that perhaps the apocalypse didn't arrive in a single instant, but took decades or even centuries to descend. Or perhaps the world had already been destroyed by the time I was born, and all that I had experienced was nothing but a shadow of a fantasy that was slowly dissipating. Who knew what the truth was? In the 4th year of the Cultural Revolution, I received a letter from the U.S. The very sight of the American stamps on it frightened me. Corresponding with foreigners was an activity subject to intense scrutiny. However, the letter's contents seemed harmless enough, consisting of a few words of greeting, cobbled together with some revolutionary language in an unnatural manner. Comrade Xie Baoshu. First, let us express together our fondest wish that the brightest, reddest sun in our hearts, Chairman Mao, live 10,000 years. As the chairman wrote in his poem, the seas roil with rage and the continents shake in fury. In America, under the leadership of Mao Zedong thought, The civil rights movement and leftist revolutionaries have made the capitalists of Wall Street tremble before the awakened power of the people. Chairman Mao was absolutely correct when he wrote that the revolutionary conditions are not just good, but great. All right, then. How are you doing? Of course, a letter came from Kiki. It had been delivered to my department, where the head of the workers' propaganda team intercepted it. This man read the letter suspiciously and then looked up at me, glaring. He slammed his hand down on the desk. Xie Baosheng, the people's eyes can see everything. Now, confess the number of foreign contacts you have. What kind of secrets exist between you and the woman who wrote this letter? I laughed. That's enough of that. You know everything there is to know about Kiki and me. Now hand me the letter. By an incredible stroke of luck, I was talking to my old friend Heizi. Formerly just an ordinary factory worker, the Cultural Revolution had turned him into a member of the workers' propaganda team that, pursuant to directives issued by the chairman, came to supervise my university. In this manner, a man who had never gone to college became the most important person in one of China's most prestigious universities. Without him, the letter would have gotten me into deep trouble. Heizi handed the letter to me and told me to burn it after reading. I read Kiki's words over and over until I figured out what she was trying to say between the lines. First, she explained that she had obtained her degree and was now teaching Chinese literature at an American college. Second, she was still unmarried and wanted to come visit me in China. I sighed and wiped my eyes. It had been 5 years since my parting from Kiki, and she still wanted me. But what could I do? Even if she returned, the most we could hope for was to be like the hero and heroine in The Second Handshake, an underground novel we passed around in handwritten copies, who could only gaze at each other, knowing that they could never be together. In the end, it didn't matter what I thought. I had no way of sending a letter to Kiki. I hid her letter in a stack of documents I took home. I didn't want Sun Qian to find it, but I also couldn't bear to burn it. Finally, I decided to conceal it between the pages of the copy of Season of Bloom, Season of Rain that had once belonged to Kiki. Although the book itself was also an example of feudal, capitalist, and revisionist thinking, I just couldn't imagine getting rid of it. I wrapped the book in a bundle of old clothes and kept it at the bottom of the trunk. Rationally, I knew that Kiki shouldn't come back, but a corner of my selfish heart continued to harbor the hope that she would. Around that time, President Nixon visited China, hoping to form an alliance with China against the Soviet Union. As the Sino-American relationship improved, hope reignited within me. However, somehow Nixon and Mao couldn't come to an agreement, and the Americans were so angry that they took revenge by manipulating the UN Security Council to expel the People's Republic of China and hand its seat at the UN to Taiwan as a legitimate representative for all of China. What little connection had existed between the US and China was completely cut off. Kiki didn't return, and I received no more news about her. In the 6th year of the Cultural Revolution, my father passed away. A few days before his death, China launched the satellite, The East is Red. It had been many years since China had sent an artificial satellite into orbit, and the occasion was marked with a great celebration. As my father lay dying, he held my hand and muttered, "When I was young, China had many satellites in space. I lost count. We even had manned spaceships in the space station. But a single little satellite is now seen as some remarkable achievement. What has happened to the world?" I had no response. That world of my childhood, a world that had once existed, now felt even more impossible than science fiction. My father closed his eyes and let out his last breath. To be fair, there were some advances in technology. The next year, the Americans managed to land on the moon with the Apollo mission, an unprecedented achievement, and the Stars and the Stripes flew on lunar soil, shocking the world. This was not good news for China. Chairman Mao had come up with a proposal that China should lead the revolution of the Third World against the developed nations in the Soviet Union. As a result, bilateral relations between China and the US and China and the Soviet Union were tense. China was also in a border conflict with the Soviet Union over Zambao Island and was completely isolated intentionally. I only heard about the American moon landing by secretly listening to banned American radio broadcasts. Two years later, my son was old enough to be called a young man. His generation was different from mine. They had no memory of the relative openness of Dun's reformist years and grew up under a barrage of propaganda centered on Mao Zedong thought. They had little exposure to Western culture and no knowledge of China's traditional culture either. They worshipped Chairman Mao with true zeal and believed it was their duty to die to protect his revolutionary path. They passionately declared that they would fight until they broke through the walls of the Kremlin, until they leveled the White House, until they liberated all of humankind. My son disliked the name Xiaobao, which meant precious, because it wasn't revolutionary enough. He renamed himself Wei Dong, which meant defend the East. He became a Red Guard. Before he had even graduated from high school, he wanted to quit school and go on revolutionary tours around the country with his friends, sharing the experience of rebelling against authority with the other Red Guards. Sun Chen and I did not like the idea at all, but this was something promoted by the leadership in Beijing. As soon as we started to object, our son brought out the little red book and denounced us as though we were class enemies. We had no choice but to let him go. None of us knew that a more violent storm lay in waiting. The Red Guard movement grew, and the young men and women turned on their teachers as reactionary academic authorities. At every school, Red Guards held mass rallies called struggle sessions to torture and denounce these enemies of the revolution. My mentor, a famous professor who had studied overseas, naturally became a target, and I was brought along to the struggle sessions as a secondary target. Half of the hair on our heads were shaved off. Tall, conical hats were stuck on top. And then our arms were pulled back and held up to force us to bow down to the revolutionary masses who hurled abuse at us. My mentor was beaten and tortured until he collapsed and lost consciousness. Only then did the mass rally end. I held my old teacher and called his name, but he didn't wake up. Heizi helped me bring him to the hospital, but it was too late. He died a few days later. The Red Guards were not satisfied with having murdered my mentor. They imprisoned me and demanded that I confess to all my past sins. What they really had in mind was my participation in the Tiananmen protests 20 years ago. I debated them by putting my academic skills to good use. I was protesting against the dark path Deng Xiaoping wanted for China. We spoke loudly, wrote openly, and demanded true revolutionary democracy. This was absolutely in line with Mao Zedong thought. We were supported by the masses of Beijing, the ordinary workers and laborers who also participated in the movement. How could you call such protests counter-revolutionary? The Red Guards lacked sufficient experience in this style of arguments to win against me. They couldn't get me for having foreign contacts either, because I had burned or buried anything having to do with America, and there was now no proof of my relationship with Kiki. But ultimately, I was probably saved because of my friendship with Heizi. After I was finally released and allowed to go home, I found out that Sun Chen had been taken away by the revolutionary rebels who had taken over her newspaper. Someone at the newspaper, it turned out, had revealed Sun Chen's long-ago affair with Liu Xiaobao in a big character poster. Liu Xiaobao was without a doubt one of the worst counter-revolutionary rightists. He had once claimed that China could only be saved by 3 centuries of Western colonization, had drafted the capitalist legalistic screed Charter 08, and had been utterly corrupt in his sexual relationships. Although he was dead, his influence continued to linger. Since Sun Quan had been his lover for several years, she must have known many of his secrets. The revolutionary rebels salivated at the prospect of interrogating one of Louis' mistresses. They held her in a cowshed, a prison set up by the newspaper, and demanded that she write her confession. Sun Quan was locked away for a whole week, and I was not allowed to see her. By the time she returned, her hair had all been shaven off and her face and arms were littered with scars. She stared at me dully, as though she no longer recognized me. Finally, she recovered and sobbed uncontrollably as I held her. She never told me what she suffered during her interrogation, and I never asked. However, not long after, many people who had once known Liu Xiaobo were imprisoned and interrogated, and the rumor was that Sun Quan's confession had been used as the foundation for accusations against them. I knew it was wrong to blame Sun Quan. In this age, survival was the only goal, and conscience was a luxury few could afford. In this manner, both Sun Quan and I were stamped with the label of counter-revolutionaries. By the time our son returned from his revolutionary tour, he found his parents to be bona fide, irredeemable class enemies. This meant that he was also considered impure. To remedy the situation, he went to the school and hung big character posters denouncing Sun Quan and me, and revealed some so-called sins that he knew we had committed. While others watched, he slapped me in the face and declared that he was no longer my son. He turned around and walked away, proud of his steadfast revolutionary ardor. I almost fainted from rage. After our son left, we were angry for a few days, but then began to worry. We asked around for news about him, but heard nothing for a couple of months. Then Hayes' son, Xiao He, came to visit. Uncle Shit, I have something to tell you. Please sit down. Xiao He and my son were good friends. I realized something was wrong. I took a deep breath and said, "Go ahead." "Wait, don't... he..." My heart sank and the world seemed to bobble around me, but I insisted that he continue. My son and Xiao He had joined a faction of Red Guards called the April 14th Brigade. He had been promoted to squad leader, but because of my status and his mother's, he was demoted and almost expelled. To show that he had completely cast us away and was a dedicated revolutionary, my son decided to take on the most dangerous task and always led every charge. A few days ago, his faction fought a battle against another faction at the university. My son rushed ahead with an iron bar, but the other side had obtained rifles from the army, and with a bang, my son's chest exploded and he collapsed to the ground. The world blacked out around me before Hayes could finish. The death of our son destroyed the only hope left for Sun Quan and me. Our hair turned white almost overnight. My mother died from the shock and grief. Although Sun Quan and I weren't even 50, we looked much older. We sat in our home with nothing to say to each other. I didn't know how we survived those dark years. I didn't really want to recall the time. Like 2 fish tossed ashore, Sun Quan and I lay gasping, trying to keep each other's gills wet with the foam from our mouths. But eventual suffocation was our certain fate. 1 year later, the Cultural Revolution ended. Mao decided to retire behind the scenes, and Liu Shaoqi became the president of China. Working with Premier Zhou Enlai, Liu tried to lead an economic recovery by instituting limited free markets and allocating land to individual families instead of collective farming by communes. Slowly, the country recovered, and colleges opened their doors again to new students. Intellectuals were treated better, and after a few years, Sun Chin and I were rehabilitated and no longer labeled rightists. The 10 years of the Cultural Revolution had decimated academia, and my department lacked qualified faculty. I had the respect of my colleagues and years of experience, but since I wasn't a member of the Communist Party, due to my political history, I was passed over for promotions. Summoning my courage, I wrote a letter to the authorities demanding the country would make better use of the few intellectuals it had left, but I heard nothing. A year later, when I had already given up all hope, my fortunes took an abrupt turn. I was promoted to full professor and given membership in the Communist Party. Even more amazingly, I was elected the department chair by a landslide. In my new position of power, I began to know some elite intellectuals. One time, I met Guo Moro, president of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He told me in confidence that Premier Zhou Enlai had read my letter and given the directive to promote me despite my flawed background. Guo told me to work hard and not disappoint the Premier. Sometime later, the Premier visited our school and asked specifically to meet me. Anxiously, I expressed my gratitude to him, and the Premier laughed. "Comrade Baoshu, I know you're a talented man. The country is trying to get back on her feet and we have to focus on science and technology. Didn't you once write science fiction? Why not write more and get our young people interested in science again?" Since the Premier and Guo Moro had both given the green light, the novels I had written were reissued in new editions. Readers had not access to such books in a long time, and the response was overwhelming. Magazines began to approach me and commission news stories, and eventually I published a few collections. Fans began to call me a famous writer. I knew very well that these news stories were nowhere near as good as my old ones. I no longer dared to write about politically sensitive subjects, and these new offerings were affected works that praised the regime without articulating anything new. But who said the world was fair? I knew I was unlikely to accomplish anything great during what remained of my career. I decided I would use the little bit of influence I had to try to help talented young people, and to that end, I began to actively participate in social functions. The good times didn't last. Soon the country hit another rough patch. China conducted another nuclear test, and once again, both the Soviet Union and the United States imposed sanctions. Food shortages became rampant, and everyone's rations were reduced. The streets were full of hungry people, and it was said that even Chairman Mao had stopped eating meat. But even so, those of us in the big cities were lucky. Heitze told me that people were starving to death in the countryside, but since no news of this kind could be published, no one knew the truth. We didn't dare to speculate or say much either. Although the Cultural Revolution was over, the political climate was still very severe. Rumor had it that when Marshal Peng Dehuai dared to offer some opinions critical of the official policy at the Lushan conference, he was severely punished. The next year, Sun Chen died. No, not from starvation. She had liver cancer. As the wife of a high-status intellectual, she could have received treatment that would have prolonged her life, but she refused it. We stuck with each other all these years. Life had been so exhausting, hasn't it? We are like those two fish in that Taoist parable. Rather than struggling to keep each other alive on land, wouldn't it have been better if we had never known each other at all, but lived free in the rivers and lakes? Don't be sad. I'm not sad to go. I held her hand, and tears made it impossible to speak. I remember something from our youth. Back then, everyone in middle school said we were a pair because we had classroom cleanup duty, but I didn't like her and she didn't like me. When we worked together, it was very awkward because we refused to talk to each other. One time, I was standing on the chair to wash the windows and started to fall. She rushed over to help, and I ended up falling on her. As we both limped to see the school nurse, the absurdity of the situation struck us, and we laughed as we blamed each other. That faded memory now felt like a preview of our time together. I really want to hear that old song again. Sun Chan's voice was fading. I haven't heard it in such a long time. Can you sing it for me? I knew the song she was talking about. Rain, Hail, or Shine by the Taiwanese singer Wakin Chow. We used to sing it all the time when we were in high school. I had forgotten most of the lyrics, and the best I could do was to recall a few fragments about love, about the pain and pleasure that dreams brought us, about regrets. I sang, my voice trembling, tears flowing down my face, and my cracked voice not sounding musical at all. But Sun Chan moved her lips along with mine. She could no longer make any noise, but she was lost in the silent music of yesteryear. The rays of the setting sun shone through the window and fell upon her, covering her gaunt face with a golden glow. We sang together like that for a long, long time. The years of starvation finally came to an end. The Soviet Union and China repaired their broken bond and trade began to grow. The Soviet Union provided us with a great deal of assistance, and the domestic economy slowly recovered. But I was now almost 60 and felt much older. I resigned from the position of department's chair, thinking I'd use what little time was left to write a few books. But I was nominated assistant dean of the university and became a standing committee member for the China Writers Association. In addition, I was picked as a delegate to the National People's Congress. I was too busy to write. One day, I received a call from Mao Deng, the Minister of Culture. The Premier had asked you to attend a diplomatic function. There's a group of avant-garde Western writers visiting, and he thinks you know one of them. Who? I don't know the details. I'll send a car for you. That evening, a car took me to the Beijing Hotel, which had one of the country's best Western-style restaurants. Many important people were in attendance, including the Premier himself, who gave a welcome address. As I surveyed the foreign visitors, I recognized the writer I was supposed to know right away. I couldn't believe my eyes. After a series of boring speeches and a formal dinner, finally the time came to mingle and converse. I walked up to that man and said, in my terrible French, "Bonsoir, Monsieur Sartre." He gazed at me curiously through his thick glasses and gave me a friendly smile. I switched to English and introduced myself. Then I told him how much I admired Lettres et la Niante and how I had written papers on it. I had never expected to see him in China. Well, Sartre cocked an eyebrow at me. I never expected anyone in China to be interested in my work. I lowered my voice. Before the Cultural Revolution, your work was very popular in China. Many people were utterly entranced by your words, though they, myself included, could not claim to truly understand your philosophy. However, I've always tried to understand the world through it. I'm honored to hear that, but you shouldn't think so highly of my words. Your own thoughts about the world are the most precious thing. Really, thinking itself is the only thing that is important. I must admit I'm surprised. I would have expected you to be a socialist. I smiled bitterly. Socialism is our life, but this form of life has turned me and many others into existentialists. Perhaps in that way the two are connected. What is your thought on existentialism? To quote you, existence précède essence. The world appears out of an essenceless abyss. Other than time, it depends on nothing, and it has no meaning. All meaning comes after the world itself, and it is fundamentally absurd. I agree with this. The existence of the world is absurd. I paused, and then, gaining courage, continued with the puzzle that had plagued me for years. Look at our world. Where does it come from? Where is it headed? When I was born, the internet had connected all parts of the globe, and high-speed railways crisscrossed the country. The store shelves were full of anything one might desire, and there were countless novels, films, TV shows. Everyone dreamed of a more wonderful future. But now, the web and mobile phones have long disappeared, and so has television. We appear to live in a world that is moving backward. Is this not absurd? Perhaps it is because our existence has no essence at all. "Sir," said the smiling Satra, "I think I understand what is troubling you, but I don't understand why you think this state is absurd." If the existence of the world has meaning, the world must advance, don't you think? Otherwise, what is the point of generation struggling after generation? The world appears to be a twisted shadow of some reality. Satra shook his head. "I know that the Chinese once had a philosopher named Zhuangzi. He told this story. If you give a monkey 3 nuts in the morning and 4 nuts in the evening, the monkey will be unhappy. But if he gives the monkey 4 nuts in the morning and only 3 in the evening, the monkey will be ecstatic. In your view, is a monkey foolish?" Yes. Zhuangzi's monkey is a byword for foolishness among the Chinese." A mocking glint came into Satra's eyes. "But how are we different from the monkey in that story? Are we in pursuit of some correct order of history? If we switch happiness and misfortune around in time, will everything appear normal to you? If we will exist in history, does it disappear merely by switching the order of events around?" I felt like I was on the verge of understanding something, but I couldn't articulate it. Satra continued. "Progress is not a constant. It is merely a temporary phase in this universe. I am no scientist, but the physicists tell us that the universe expands and it collapses, and it expands again, not unlike the cosmic cycles envisioned by your Taoist philosophers. Time could easily flow in another direction, or in one of the countless directions. Perhaps events can be arranged in any number of different sequences, because time may choose from an infinite set of options. Remember the aphorism of Heraclitus. Time is a child playing dice. The kingly power is a child's. But so what? Whichever direction time takes, what meaning does it all have? The world exists. Its existence precedes essence because its very existence is seeped into nothingness. It is absurd regardless of the order of events within it. Perhaps you are right. Had time picked another direction, the universe would be very different. Humanity would progress from darkness to light, from sorrow to joy, but such a universe would not be any better. In the end, joy belongs to those who are born in times of joy, and suffering belongs to those born in times of suffering. In the eyes of God, it makes no difference. Some say that if war were to break out between Soviet Union and the United States, the world would end. But I say that apocalypse has long since survived. It has been with us since the birth of the world, but we have become inured to it by familiarity. The end of the world comes not with the destruction of everything, but with the fact that nothing that happens around us has any meaning. The world has returned to primordial chaos, and we have nothing. Satra stopped, as though expecting me to say something. My mind was utterly confused, and after a while I said, "What, then, is the hope for humanity?" "Hope has always existed and always will," he said solemnly. "But hope is not the future, because time does not have an inevitable direction. Hope is now, in existence itself, in nothingness. The truth of nothingness is freedom. Man has always had the freedom to choose, and this is the only comfort and grace offered to humanity." I understand that's your theory, but do you really think that freedom to choose belongs to humanity? My voice grew sharper. 30 years ago, I was separated from the woman I loved on the other side of the ocean. Then I returned here. I do not know where she is or whether she is still alive. Can I choose to go find her? A few years back, tens of millions of people died from starvation in this country. If possible, they would have all chosen to survive, because they have survived. Let me tell you something. Many honorable and great men and women choose communism, believing it would save humanity from suffering. But have you seen the results of their choices? Have you seen what has happened to China? The freedom of mankind is but a fantasy, a cheap consolation. Our state is despair. Setra was silent for a while. Then he said, "Perhaps you are right, but the meaning of freedom is that you can always choose, though there is no promise that your choice will become a reality. Maybe this is a cheap consolation, but other than this, we have nothing." I don't know if I really understood Setra, or maybe even he couldn't express himself clearly. He stayed in China for more than a month, and we saw each other often. He said he would try to think about what I said and write a new book, but then he left China, and I never saw him again. The next few years were a golden age for the People's Republic. The Cultural Revolution was a distant memory, and the later anti-rightist movements were also deemed historical errors. As the cultural sphere grew more animated and open, dissent was tolerated, and many different opinions could be voiced. The central leadership adjusted the socialist economic model through new democratic reforms that permitted some measure of private enterprise. The Soviet Union and China entered a honeymoon period, and with Soviet aid, China announced a new 5-year plan of full-scale development. Everywhere people were excited and threw themselves into their work with passion. Once again, we began to hope for a better future. But hope did not last. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Cold War heated up again. An American plot overthrew Cuba's Castro, and the dictator Batista came into power. The communist forces were driven from the Americas, and then the Korean Peninsula became a new flashpoint. Along the 38th parallel, both sides amassed forces, and war broke out without anybody knowing who had fired the first shot. China could not help but become involved, and young men from China had to go to Korea to help fight for the survival of the Republic. This was the first time in living memory that China and the United States fought directly. The Americans had picked the moment in China's history when China was at her weakest, when she needed peace and recovery the most. Every sign indicated that China was going to lose. Incredibly, however, the Chinese volunteers, who possessed nothing except courage, pushed back the American assault and forced the American army to a standstill along the 38th parallel. This was not achieved without great cost. It was said that hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions, gave their lives. I didn't know the exact figure, but considering that even Chairman Mao's son died in battle, one could imagine how desperate and fierce the fighting was. The war caused the economy to collapse. Prices soared and more hardships were added to the people's lives. Dissatisfaction with the government grew, and a name long forbidden began to surface in conversations. Chiang Kai-shek. He was a hardened anti-communist. Although the situation across the Taiwan Straits had long been tense due to the mainland's overwhelming advantage over the island, Taiwan's leaders had always pursued a policy of de facto independence, only passively resisting any mainland advances. But 20 years ago, after Chiang Kai-shek came into power, he declared that he would reclaim the mainland. Since the war in Korea had reached a stalemate, the Americans encouraged Chiang to join the conflict. He thus declared his intention to carry out his old promise. With American support, Taiwan's fighters and warships encroached upon the mainland coast, and pamphlets were dropped in Guangzhou, Shanghai, and other cities. Taiwan's army entered Burma and harassed the border with China. It was said that parts of the Yunnan province had already fallen to Chiang's forces. Tibet declared independence and would no longer heed orders from Beijing. Bandits under the flag of the Nationalist Army killed and looted the rural countryside. Spies in various cities began to put up anti-communist posters. The government responded by cracking down on counter-revolutionaries, but the effects appeared slight. Rumors were rampant and the population grew restless. The central leadership signed a ceasefire with the Americans and pulled the army back into China in an attempt to stabilize the domestic situation. Chiang Kai-shek then launched an all-out assault, and the peace across the Taiwan Straits that had lasted an entire lifetime ended as the Chinese Civil War began. With the help of the American 7th Fleet, the Nationalist Army landed in Guangdong. They headed north and conquered Nanjing. The Central leadership pulled the troops that had returned from Korea to the southern front, but the troops were tired of fighting and surrendered to the nationalists en masse, raising the flag of the Republic of China, a blue sky with a white sun. In little more than a year, all territory south of the Yangtze had fallen to the nationalists, and even the north appeared to be teetering on the precipice. During that time, through my connections in the Soviet Union, I had unexpectedly received a copy of Sartre's new book, which recorded his impressions of China. Sartre also sent me a long letter in which she discussed some further thoughts about our conversations. It was highly technical and rather hard to read. However, near the end, an almost casually tossed off line shocked me. Recently, a Chinese-American scholar came to Paris to visit me. Her name is Zhao Qi, and she had been away from China for many decades. Kiki! My Kiki! The world spun around me. I forced myself to be calm and continued to read. She is an excellent scholar, and she wishes to return to her homeland to do what she can to help. I mentioned you to her, and she said she would like to visit you in Beijing. The letter went on to discuss other matters I did not care about. For a long while, my mind was in utter chaos. When I finally calmed down, I figured out what Sartre really meant. During the months we spent together, I told him about Kiki and asked for his help to find out news about her if he ever visited the United States. The reason he had crafted his letter to make it sound as if Kiki and I were strangers was an attempt to protect us in the event the letter was read by others. The important news was that Kiki was going to return to Beijing to find me. This was actually a consequence of the present crisis. The reason that Kiki couldn't return to China before was because of the Cold War, but if the political situation changed, the barrier between us would be lifted. Sartre's real message to me was simple. If you want to see Kiki again, find a way to stay in Beijing. While I waited excitedly in Beijing, another piece of shocking news arrived. Chiang Kai-shek proclaimed that the Republic of China was reasserting its sovereignty over the entire country. The capital would be returned to Nanjing, and Beijing would be renamed Beiping. He vowed to cross the Yangtze and slaughter every last communist until China was unified. The next day, Heizi came to find me, holding a pamphlet in his hand. "What is wrong with you? Why are you still here?" "Where am I supposed to go?" I was baffled. "Don't you know?" Heizi handed the pamphlet to me. "A nationalist airplane dropped us earlier today." I read the pamphlet. Basically, it said that the nationalists were winning victory after victory in their advance north, and they would soon conquer Beiping. Everyone would be pardoned, with the exception of a list of major war criminals. The pamphlet went on to urge communist officers and soldiers to surrender. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked. "Look at the back." I flipped the sheet of paper over. It was a list of major communist war criminals. I glanced through the names. Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Liu Shaoqi. There were at least 100 names, and most were important figures in the party or the government. The penultimate name was Guo Moreau, my old friend. The last name on the list was even more familiar. Xie Baoshu. "What is my name doing here?" "Of course you're on there," said Heizi. "Have you forgotten who you are? You've been the dean of the university, the secretary general of the China Federation of Literary Arts Circles, standing committee member of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, and you are always showing up at state banquets. As far as the cultural sphere is concerned, you and Guo Moreau are the two biggest fish." "Those are just honorary titles. I've never done anything." "It really doesn't matter. They need a name on there to show they mean business. It might as well be yours." Heizi sighed. "I heard that Chiang Kai-shek had started purges in the south. Anybody connected with the communists is executed, and he's killed enough people to make the river flow red. He hung many of the bodies from lampposts to instill terror. Since you're on the list, if Beijing were to fall, you better get out." I smiled bitterly. "I think it's too late for that. What are your plans?" "My wife and I will follow our son, of course. Xiao Hei is still in the army. In fact, he's still a member of the guard for the central leadership. He's arranged for us to go to the northeast. We leave in 2 days. Old friend, I really think you need to plan for this. A few days later, the nationalists were almost at the city. Artillery shells were already exploding in Beijing. Somebody passed me a copy of an article published in a newspaper in Nanjing, which was supposed to describe the crimes of communist bandit leaders. The section on me claimed I had betrayed Liu Xiaobo after my arrest post-Tiananmen, that I had served as a tool of the regime during the Cultural Revolution, that after coming into power I had abused my authority to suppress anyone who disagreed with me, that I had written science fiction novels spreading propaganda about communism and advocating corrupt sexual practices, that I had emboldened and invigorated the totalitarian system. In a word, I must be executed to pacify the people's anger. I had to laugh at this. Here I was, thinking I had accomplished nothing in my life, but in this article I was an amazing villain with extraordinary powers. That night, a squad of fully armed soldiers woke me by banging on the door. They were members of the guard for the central leadership, and the officer in charge was Xiaohei. Uncle Xie, we are here with orders to escort you out of the city. Where are you going? The commander of Beijing's peripheral defenses have betrayed us, Xiaohei said. That bastard surrendered, and the nationalists are now attacking the city. To avoid the destruction of the city's cultural artifacts and ancient buildings, the central leadership has decided to retreat. We've got to go now. No, I'm too old to run. I'll wait here. Whatever happens is fate. Uncle Xie, you're on the list of war criminals. If you stay here, you'll die for sure. He continued trying to change my mind, but I refused to budge. One of his soldiers got impatient and pointed his gun at me. Xie Baoshu, if you don't leave, then you try to betray the revolution and surrender to the enemy. I'll kill you right now. Xiaohei pushed the gun barrel down. Uncle Xie, I'm sorry, but we're under strict orders. You must leave with us. If you don't come willingly, we'll have to resort to cruder measures. I sighed. Fine, give me a few minutes to pack some things. An hour later, deep in the night, the soldiers and I got into a jeep and drove west. Many buildings along the way had already collapsed from artillery fire, and the road was filled with pits. Electricity had been shut off, and all the streetlights were dark. Other than columns of soldiers, I saw almost no pedestrians. Tanks passed from time to time, and I could hear the distant rumble of cannons. I was reminded of another bloody night 40 years ago. The car drove past Tiananmen along the Avenue of Eternal Peace. Under the cold light of the moon, I saw that this square that had once held tens of thousands of idealistic young hearts, the great hall of the people, and the monument to the people's heroes had both been reduced to heaps of rubble. A bare flagstaff stood in the middle of the square, but the red flag with 5 golden stars was no longer flying from it. Instead, it lay crumpled on the ground. A few soldiers were working on the gates of heavenly peace itself, taking down the portrait of Chairman Mao so that it could be carried away. I still couldn't believe I was witnessing the end of the country in which I was born. I thought I had been through too much to ever be moved by the shifting vicissitudes of fortune. But I was wrong. In that moment, my eyes grew blurry. Tiananmen became an old watercolor painting, dissolving in my hot tears. One time, the entire country celebrated the founding of the People's Republic with a parade through this very square. One time, students from around the country gathered here to demand democracy. One time, Chairman Mao stood here and surveyed the Red Guards. Where were they now? Had it all been a dream? Equally broken lay the dream of reuniting with Kiki. I had waited so long in the city for her, but by the time she managed to return to her homeland, in which corner of China would I find myself? Perhaps we would never meet again until death. No one spoke. The car bumped along and left war-torn Beijing, heading for the western hills. A lamp is lit on the mountain in the east. The light falls on a mountain in the west. The plain between them is smooth and vast, but I can't seem to find you. The lowest plateau of central China lay before us. The yellow earth, deposited by dust storms over the eons, stretched to the horizon. Thousands of years of erosion had carved countless canyons and channels in it, like the wrinkles left by time on our faces. The barren terraced fields bore silent testimony to the hardships endured by the people eking out a living on this ancient land. Baoshu Mountain, the symbol of the town of Yan'an, stood not far from us, and the yellow river flowed past the foot of it. The folk song echoed between the canyons, lingering for a long time. People enjoy love songs, even in a place like this, said Heizi. Oh, do you remember that popular song about the Lowe's Plateau from when we were young? Back then I was so curious what the place really looked like. I never got to see it until now, when it's become my home. Fate is really funny sometimes. For the last few years, as the Civil War raged on, I had followed the People's Liberation Army, first to Hebei, and then to the liberated regions in the center of the country, and finally here, to Yan'an, where I unexpectedly bumped into my old friend. Heizi had been in the northeast until he followed his son here, but his wife had died during the siege of Changchun. Although the PLA had begun the civil war with a series of crushing defeats, under the leadership of Ling Bao, Peng Duohua, and Lu Bocheng, the PLA soon rallied and pushed back. Chiang Kai-shek became the president of the Republic of China in Nanjing, but his dream of unifying China couldn't be realized. The more he tried to exterminate the communists, the more his own hold on power appeared to waver. The communists managed to hold on to some liberated zones in northern China, and the two sides settled into a cease-firing stalemate. Since both factions were tired of the fighting, they declared a ceasefire and began negotiations in Chongqing, hoping to form a new coalition government. But since neither side was willing to compromise, the talks went nowhere. While China was embroiled in the Civil War, extreme militarists came to power in Japan and launched an invasion of China. They advanced quickly and forced Chiang Kai-shek to leave Nanjing and move the capital temporarily to Chongqing. The Japanese then invaded the Philippines and opened a new Pacific front against the American forces stationed there. The Americans were completely unprepared and fled before the might of Japan. In distant Europe, a madman named Hitler rose to prominence in Germany with the support of the army and instantly declared war on the Soviet Union. The German forces reclaimed East Germany and invaded France. The whole world had descended into the first truly global war in history. The Cold War was dissolved before this new threat. The Americans and the Soviets, erstwhile enemies, formed an alliance against the new Axis powers of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Meanwhile, in China, the nationalists and the communists had put aside their differences to fight together for the survival of the Chinese people against the Japanese slaughter. Thus did history turn over a new page. After arriving in Yan'an, I didn't want any more to do with the administration or politics. I dedicated myself to collecting folk songs and preserving traditional arts, which I enjoyed. Although my life was no longer comfortable, I lived in a traditional cave dwelling and subsisted on coarse grains just like all the local peasants. I counted myself lucky. It was a time of war, after all. While Heizi and I reminisced, a young student ran up the mountainous path toward us. "Teacher, someone is here looking for you." He struggled to catch his breath. "Who?" I didn't even get up. I was too old to be excited. "An old lady. I think she's from America." I jumped up and grabbed him. "An old lady? What's her name? How old is she?" I'm not sure. I guess over 60. She's talking with the Dean of Arts Academy. The Dean said you know her." "From America. Over 60. An old lady. My Kiki. She's here. She's finally here." I started to run, but I was too old. I couldn't catch my breath and I felt dizzy. I had to slow down and Heizi caught up to me. "Do you really think it's Kiki?" he asked. "Of course it is. Heizi slapped me. I want to be sure I'm not dreaming." Like a true friend, Heizi slapped me in the face, hard. I put my hand against my cheek, savoring the pain, and laughed. "Don't get too excited," said Heizi. "Zhao Qi is your age, isn't she? She's not a pretty young lady anymore. It's been decades since you've seen her. You might be disappointed." "That's ridiculous. Look at all of us. We're like candle stubs sputtering in our last moments of glory. Seeing her one more time before I die would be more than enough." Heizi chuckled. "You might be old, but you're still in good health. I bet the parts of your body that matter still work pretty well. How about this? If you two are going to get married, I want to be the witness." I laughed and felt calmer. We chatted as we descended the mountain, and then my heart began to leap wildly again as I approached the Arts Academy. I didn't recognize her. She was Caucasian. Although her hair was turning white, I could tell it had once been blonde. Blue eyes stared at me thoughtfully out of an angled, distinctive face. Although she was not young, she was still beautiful. I was deeply disappointed. That foolish student hadn't even clarified whether he was talking about a Chinese or a foreigner. "Hello," the woman said. Her Chinese was excellent. "Are you Mr. Xie Baoshu?" "I am. May I ask your name?" "I'm Anna Louise Strong, a writer." I recognized the name. She was a leftist American author who lived in Beijing and written several books about the China of the Mao era. She was friends with both Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. Though I knew who she was, I had never met her. I heard she had moved back to the U.S. around the same time Shin Qian died. Why was she looking for me? Anna looked uncomfortable, and I felt uneasy. She hesitated and then said, "I have something important to tell you, but perhaps it's best to speak in private." I led her to my cave. Anna retrieved a bundle from her suitcase, which she carefully unwrapped. Anxiously, I watched as she set a crude brown ceramic jar down on the table. Solemnly, she said, "This holds the ashes of Miss Zhao Qi." I stared at the jar, unable to connect this strange artifact with the lovely, graceful Kiki of my memory. "What are you saying?" I asked. I simply could not make sense of what she was telling me. "I'm sorry, but she's dead." The air in the cave seemed to solidify. I stood rooted in place, unable to speak. "Are you all right?" Anna asked. After a while, I nodded. "I'm fine. Oh, would you like a cup of water?" I was surprised I could think about such irrelevant details at that moment. I had imagined the scene of our reunion countless times, and of course I had imagined the possibility that Kiki was already dead. I always thought I would howl, scream, fall to the ground, or even faint. But I was wrong. I was amazed by how calmly I accepted the news. Maybe I had always known there would be no happily ever after in my life. "When?" I asked. 3 days ago, in Luochuang. Anna told me that Kiki had been looking for me for years. Although I had some notoriety as a war criminal, because I was part of the Communist Army and always on the march, it was impossible to locate me. Once war broke out with Japan, the nationalists and the communists both became American allies, and it was no longer difficult to travel to China. Kiki finally heard that I was in Yan'an and bought a ticket on a boat crossing the Pacific. On the voyage, she met Anna and the two became friends. On the long ride across the ocean, she told Anna our story. Anna and Kiki arrived in Hong Kong, but as most of eastern China had fallen to Japanese occupation, they had to get on another boat to Guangxi, from whence they passed through Guizhou and Sichuan, and then continue north through Shaanxi to finally arrive in Yan'an. But Zhao Qi was no longer a young woman, Anna said, and with her handicap, the journey was very tough on her. By the time she arrived in Xi'an, she fell ill, and yet she forced herself to go on so that she wouldn't slow us down. In Luochuang, her condition deteriorated. Because of the war, we couldn't get the medicine she needed. We tried everything, but we couldn't save her. Anna stopped, unable to continue. Don't blame yourself. You did your best. I tried to console her. Anna looked at me strangely, as if unable to comprehend my calmness. Why don't you tell me what her life in America was like following our separation? I asked. Anna told me that after I left, Keiki continued her studies in the US, waiting for me. She wrote to me several times but never received any replies. Once she was awarded her PhD, she taught in college and then remarried. 10 years ago, after her husband died, she wanted to return to China, but the Civil War put those plans on hold. Finally, only days from Yan'an, she died. Since they couldn't carry her body through the mountains, they had to cremate her. Thus, I was deprived of the chance to see her one last time. No, I interrupted. I picked up the jar of ashes. Kiki and I are together now, and will never be apart again. Thank you. I ignored Anna's stare as I held the jar against my chest and muttered to myself. Tears flowed down my face, the tears of happiness. The setting sun, red as blood, floated next to the ancient pagoda on the Baoshu mountain. It cast its remaining light over northern China, veiling everything in a golden red hue. The Yang River sparkled in the distance, and I could see a few young soldiers, barely more than boys, playing in the water. I sat under a tree. Kiki sat next to me, resting her head on my shoulder. The pendulum of life appeared to have returned to the origin. After all we had witnessed and endured, she and I had traversed countless moments, both bitter and sweet, and once again leaned against each other. It didn't matter how much time had passed us by. It didn't matter if we were alive or dead. It was enough that we were together. I'm not sure if you know this, I said. After your mother died during the Cultural Revolution, I helped to arrange her funeral. She had suffered some because of her relationship to you, but she died relatively peacefully. In her last moments, she asked me to tell you to stay away from China and to try to live a good life. But I always knew you would return. Do you remember Heizi? He's in Yan'an too. Even at his age, he's as goofy as he was when he was a boy. Last month he told me that if you came back, we'd all go climb Baoshu Mountain together, just like when we were kids. Don't worry, the mountain is not very high. I can carry you if you have trouble with your leg. It's been 20 years since my mother's death. There used to be 2 jade bracelets that had been in my family for generations. My mother planned to give one each to you and me. Later, she gave one to Shen Qian, but the Red Guards broke it because it was a feudal relic. I hid the other, hoping to give it to you. Have a look. I hope you like it. I opened the bundle that had been on my back and took out a smooth jade bracelet. In the sun's last rays, it glowed brightly. You want to know what else is in the bundle? I chuckled. Lots of good things. I've been carrying them around for years. It hasn't been easy to keep them safe. Look. I took out the treasures of my memory one by one. The English letters Kiki had written to me in high school. The new concept English cassette tapes she gave me. The posters for Tokyo Love Story. A lock of hair I begged from her after we started dating. The purple hair clip she wore to Tiananmen Square. A few photographs of us taken in New York. The revolutionese letter she sent me during the Cultural Revolution. I examined each object carefully, remembering. It was like gazing through a time telescope at moments as far away as galaxies, or perhaps like diving into a sea of history in search of forgotten treasure in sunken ships. The distant years had settled deep into the strata of time, turning into indistinct fossils. But perhaps they were also like seeds that would germinate after years of quiescence and poke through the crust of our souls. Finally, at the bottom of the bundle, I found a copy of Season of Bloom, Season of Rain. She left it in my home after visiting my family during middle school, but I hadn't read it in years. More than 50 years later, the pages had turned yellow and brittle. I held it in my hand and caressed the cover wrap Kiki had made, admiring her handwriting. The smooth texture of the poster paper felt strangely familiar, as though I was opening a tunnel into the past. I opened the book, thinking I would read a few pages. But my hand felt something strange. I looked closely. There was something trapped between the paper poster wrap and the original cover of the book. Carefully, I unwrapped the poster paper, but I had underestimated the fragility of the book. The cover was torn off, and the rectangular card fell out like a colorful butterfly. It fluttered to the ground after a brief dance in the sunlight. I picked it up. It was a high-definition photograph, probably taken with a digital camera. Fireworks exploded in the night sky, and in the distant background was a glowing screen on which you could make out the shape of some magnificent stadium. I recognized it, the bird's nest. In the foreground were many people dressed in colorful clothes, holding balloons and Chinese flags, and cotton candy and popcorn. Everyone was laughing, pointing, strolling. In the middle of the photograph were two children about 4 years old. One was a boy in a gray jacket, the other a girl in a pink dress. They stood together, holding hands. Illuminated by the fireworks exploding overhead, the smiles on their flushed faces were pure and innocent. I stared at the photograph for a long time and then flipped it over. I saw a graceful line of handwritten characters. Beauty is about to go home. Take care, my gray wolf. More than 50 years earlier, Kiki had hidden this present to me in a book she had forgotten. I had never unwrapped it. I remember the last conversation I had with Anna. What did she say before she died? She was delirious, but she said she would return to the past you two shared, to the place where she met you for the first time and wait for you. I don't know what she meant. Maybe all of us will return there someday. Where? To the origin of the universe, of life, of time, to the time before the world began. Perhaps we could choose another direction and live another life. I don't understand. I don't, either. Maybe our lives are lived in order to comprehend this mystery, and we'll understand only at the end. It's time, isn't it? I asked Kiki. We'll go back together. Would you like that? Kiki said nothing. I closed my eyes. The world dissolved around me. Layer after layer peeled back, and era after era emerged and returned to nothingness. Strings of shining names fell from the empyrean of history, as though they had never existed. We were 30, 20, 15, 5. Not just me and Kiki, but also Sun Chan, Heizi, and everyone else. We returned to the origin of our lives, turning into babies, into fetuses. In the deepest abyss of the world, the beginning of consciousness stirred, ready to choose new worlds, new timelines, new possibilities. The sun had fallen beneath the horizon in the east, and the long day was about to end. But tomorrow, the sun would rise in the west again, bathing the world in a kinder light. On the terraced fields along the slope of the mountain, millions of poppy flowers trembled, blooming, burning incomparably bright in the last light of dusk.